Yu-Gi-Oh! Has one of the most insane casts of characters in anime history, from ancient Egyptian pharaohs to teenage billionaire geniuses,
to that one dude who wanted to take Téa on a date and played a bunch of DDR.
Each duelist has their own unique story, decks, and playstyles that make them special, which is crazy because in the 220 plus episodes of this series and 3 major movies,
Yu-Gi-Oh! Has introduced 69 duelists.
That said, I am only covering actual duel monsters for this, for the most part, so I won't be talking about dungeon dice, capsule monsters, or deckmaster stuff, unless that's the only relevant thing for those characters. But if you're excited about some Yu-Gi-Oh! Content and want to see more in the future, remember to leave a like and subscribe to Uproar Media for more videos like this. But like I said, I have a ton of characters to get through, so let's not waste any time and just get into it. And while I will try to keep most things in order of appearance in the series, I think it makes sense to start by looking back at a few of our duelists from ancient Egypt to set the stage. I am going to be going through the background stuff pretty quickly though, but if you want a full deep dive into the entire Yu-Gi-Oh! Timeline, let us know in the comments. 5,000 years ago before the start of the series, if you're watching the 4Kids dub, it's 3,000 in the Japanese, we have 3 duelists that we need to talk about. These are Pharaoh Atem, his cousin the priest Seto, and the bandit king Bakura. And their story starts with the Millennium Spellbook. This is a mystical tome passed down from pharaoh to pharaoh that caused neighboring regions to constantly attack Egypt in hopes of stealing it so that they could decipher the spells inside and create unstoppable armies of monsters. Because of this, Pharaoh Akhenaten and his brother Akhenaten decided to learn its secrets for themselves so they could defend against these enemies. This led to them performing a ritual where they sacrificed 99 villagers from Koelna, and once these villagers were killed, their remains were melted down into 7 gold tools called the Millennium Items. However, one member of the village survived and witnessed all of this, that being a young boy named Bakura. This ritual also summoned an evil ancient spirit who created the Shadow Realm called Zork Necrophades into the world as well. Afterwards, the Millennium Pendant was carried by Pharaoh Akhenaten, and the other 6 items were given to members of his court. With their powers, Egypt summoned their own army of duel monsters to fend off invaders and solidified their position of power. And that finally brings us to Akhenaten's son, Atem. When Atem was young, his father brought him to an ancient tomb where he prayed for forgiveness from the Egyptian gods for the crime of bringing the Millennium Items into the world. Akhenaten offered his own life in hopes that his son would be free to live without the gods' judgment. And the very short version of the events from here is that Bakura attempts to take revenge for his village's destruction by collecting the Millennium Items to summon Zork fully into the world. Meanwhile, Seto, who had been abandoned by his father Akhenaten, had managed to rise through Egyptian society and join the royal court again, as he should have by being Akhenaten's son. Akhenaten sees this and begins believing that his son has beaten impossible odds by becoming nobility again, which means that he should be the rightful pharaoh rather than Atem. This festers until Akhenaten joins Bakura and Zork and begins trying to kill Atem so that his son can rule. And speaking of Seto, after being abandoned by his father, he and his mother live in poverty in a small village. One day, he saves a girl named Kisara from slave traders, and those slave traders go on to set fire to the entire village, killing Seto's mother in the process. This is when Kisara unconsciously releases the dragon spirit within her to take out these assailants. Years later, Seto finds Kisara again as she is being stoned because of how she looks, and Shada mentions to him that he senses incredible strength inside of her that rivals the Egyptian gods. Later, Akhenaten and Zork brainwash Seto to try and manipulate him into usurping Atem by using the Blue Eyes White Dragon to battle against Atem's Dark Magician, setting the stage for the rivalry between Seto and Yugi in the future. Luckily, Kisara saves him, though she is mortally wounded in the process. As she dies, the Blue Eyes White Dragon spirit is released from within her, and Akhenaten seals it inside of a stone tablet. But Kisara ultimately manages to take Akhenaten out all the same, and Seto is freed from his control and made the new keeper of the Blue Eyes White Dragon. Zork then turns his attention to the destruction of Egypt, and Atem summons all 3 Egyptian gods to fend him off, but even that isn't enough. The gods are eventually turned into stone, and Zork's rampage continues until Atem casts a forbidden spell that seals both himself and Zork inside the Millennium Pendant. This seal could only be undone with Atem's name when all of the Millennium Items were brought together and placed inside of an ancient stone. And so he wipes his own memories to ensure that it will never be spoken again. And that is the super abridged version of how Atem was sealed in the puzzle, why Kaiba is bound to the Blue Eyes, and the basis for all the spooky shit that happens involving Bakura. And now that we know all that, we can hop 3 to 5,000 years into the future to the 1960s, when a team of British archaeologists find the Millennium Puzzle in the Valley of the Kings, where most of them die mysterious deaths inside the temple, with the sole survivor being Solomon Moto. Decades pass, and no one is able to even come close to solving the puzzle until a young Yugi Muto finds it in his grandfather's game shop. For the next 8 years, he tries to put it together, and he eventually succeeds, releasing the Pharaoh's spirit and bringing back shadow games into the world. From here, both Yugi and Atem would share the same body, and would be able to switch between each other at will, with Yugi being much kinder, softer, and more insecure, while Atem was dark, brutal, and basically made of confidence. However, Atem still didn't have his memories, so together they work towards uncovering his past, and along the way they learn from each other to become more well-rounded people who overcome their own weaknesses. But let's get into their decks. As the main character of the series, Yugi has had several decks which change and evolve throughout each season. However, there is always a constant theme of using powerful spells and trap cards to perform dynamic combos that could turn the tide of battle. The whole theme of his playstyle is to make the impossible happen, be it coming back from the worst situation imaginable, or summoning the unstoppable Exodia, all of which he is able to do by believing in the heart of the cards, aka using the Millennium Puzzle's magic to manipulate the deck and allow him to draw the perfect card whenever he needs it. Which sounds a bit like cheating to me, but who am I to argue? Yugi inherits his first consistent deck of the series from his grandfather to take on Seto Kaiba. It is primarily made up of small earth and dark monsters like Beaver Warrior and Giant Soldier of Stone, many of which have spell cards to empower them, like Horn of the Unicorn, Full Moon, or Book of Secret Arts. If that wasn't enough, spells like Swords of Revealing Light, Dark Hole, Mystic Box, and Monster Reborn, as well as traps like Mirror Force and Spellbinding Circle, could give Yugi time to access and find his better cards or stronger monsters like Dark Magician, Gaia the Fierce Knight, and Summon Skull. But most importantly for Yugi's first big duel is that these spells and traps could be used to buy him time so that he could draw all 5 pieces of Exodia, which lets him beat Seto Kaiba, the current world champion. This draws the attention of Maximillion Pegasus, who uses his Millennium Eye to hold Solomon Moto's soul hostage and forces Yugi to travel to Duelist Kingdom to save him, which would be a lot harder as Weevil Underwood tosses all of the Exodia pieces into the ocean on the way to the tournament. In Duelist Kingdom, Yugi takes on Mako Tsunami, Mokuba, a ghost of Kaiba, Panic, and the Paradox Brothers on his way to collecting all the star chips, all while making use of extremely creative solutions like destroying the moon to lower the tide and weaken Mako's water monsters, or using burning lands to even the odds against Weevil's bugs in the forest, and combining Swords of Revealing Light and Catapult Turtle to break Panic's Castle of Dark Illusions and destroy all of his monsters. And while all of these duels could be kinda rough at times, with the Pharaoh's help, he always pulls through. That is, until his rematch with Kaiba, in which Kaiba threatens to jump from the castle if he loses. Atem is willing to make that sacrifice if it means winning so they could save Grandpa, but this brutal anything-to-win attitude scares Yugi, and he has a massive crisis of character. Kaiba ends up winning when Yugi gives up, taking all of Yugi's star chips in the process, but luckily, Mai shows up, knocks some sense into him, and with that, Yugi enters the final portion of the tournament inside of Pegasus's castle. He first takes on Mai, then takes out Joey thanks to the time wizard that he just so happened to give him earlier, which just so happened to empower Dark Magician, and ultimately goes on to even defeat the mind-reading Pegasus by swapping between Yugi and Atem each turn so that Pegasus can't access their thoughts. As a result of this, Yugi saves his grandpa and the Kaibas, gives Joey enough prize money to pay for his sister's surgery, and earns the title of King of Games. But then, in his very next duel, Yugi loses. Well, sort of. In the non-canon duel against Rebecca Hawkins, Yugi duels entirely on his own without Atem's help, and Rebecca wins. So there. Proof that Yugi isn't a good duelist without Atem. However, as it turns out, he intentionally throws the match to teach Rebecca that there is more to the game than just winning, and he surrenders despite having the cards he needs to win in hand. Following that, he takes on Bandit Keith, who is under Marik's control, again without Atem's help, though this duel would end prematurely. At least his next duel against Johnny Steps ends in a win for him though, so that's something. Of note, of the 16 duels that Yugi has taken part in prior to Battle City, he has a record of 11 wins, 3 losses, and 2 duels that didn't finish. However, of his 3 losses, he should have won all of them. Against Pegasus, he was in the middle of attacking for game when time ran out. He chose to lose to Kaiba, so Kaiba didn't jump off the castle, and he chooses to surrender against Rebecca, again, despite having the win. So to this point, Yugi hasn't actually been in a losing position from any of these games. With that though, we move on to Battle City, where the rules of the game are changed, in that there are actual rules going forward. Alongside this, Yugi begins using a new deck with a ton of separate combo strategies in it. Magnet Warriors, Jack Queen and King's Knight, Chimera, Dark Magician and Dark Magician Girl, and of course, the God cards. He also uses Joey's Red Eyes through this season as well. On top of that, new spells like Pot of Greed, Premature Burial, Change of Heart, and traps like Magic Cylinder round things out quite a bit. It's just everything he was doing before, but bigger and more explosive. Again, Yugi goes completely undefeated in Battle City with the exception of a draw against Joey while Marik was controlling him. He also has a battle against Joey later that we don't see the result of, but I mean, Yugi won.
Can't believe I beat you with Swordsman of Landstar. Stop ruining Yu-Gi-Oh, Joey!
However, there are some crazy moments in this season for Yugi in particular. For example, taking on Arcana in a Dark Magician mirror match, the infinite draw combo against Strings and Slifer, and of course, taking out Kaiba's Obelisk and Marik's Ra. Once he wins the God cards, Marik reveals the hieroglyphics carved onto his back, which explain how to recover the Pharaoh's memories, which should be the next thing that they do, but first we need to take a quick hop over to another filler arc with Waking the Dragons. Basically, an even ancienter king named Darts from Atlantis 10,000 years ago was trying to collect powerful souls so that he could resurrect a monster called the Leviathan that would destroy the world so that he could rebuild it in his image. And Atem has a particularly powerful soul that would help with that quite a bit. While most of the season doesn't super matter because it isn't canon, there is some interesting stuff going on with Atem in particular. He begins being tempted and corrupted by the Orichalcos, which comes to a head in his battle against Raphael. This dude believes that he is right for collecting souls for darts, while being told that Atem was an evil leader in Egypt. This puts Atem on a crazy tilt, and Raphael goes on to back Atem into a corner to the point that the Pharaoh activates the Seal of Orichalcos to give himself an advantage in their match, even knowing that activating this triggers a shadow game where the loser will have their soul taken away. Yugi is super against this, but Atem does it anyways, and in the end, he loses the duel and Yugi needs to sacrifice himself so that the Pharaoh can continue on to defeat Darts. This whole thing is like an enhanced version of what happened after their match with Kaiba in Duelist Kingdom. Atem prioritizes winning to the point of doing something terrible, but this time, Yugi is giving him the chance to learn from it and fix things on his own. Outside of that, it's kind of the typical defeat the bad guy, rescue Yugi and everyone else's soul, and save the world kind of story. As for his deck, there aren't a ton of updates in this season. We do see a few new additions, but most important is the Dragon Timaeus and all the cards that it can fuse into. And of course, there's the Curry Babylon stuff and Berserker Soul. Those are kind of cool as well. But that aside, it isn't hugely different, and all of that stuff disappears as we move into the following filler arc, the Grand Championship. But that is more about Kaiba, so we're going to move all the way to Dawn of the Duel. Once the filler arcs are out of the way, Yugi and Atem get back to their main goal of learning the Pharaoh's past, which is largely explored through Bakura's Ultimate Shadow game, the dark RPG where Bakura and Atem would relive and manipulate everything that happened back in ancient Egypt that led to Atem stealing himself and Zork away. If Atem could actually stop Zork this time, he would win, but if he couldn't, then Bakura does. Naturally, they pull through though, as Atem remembers his name and combines the Egyptian gods into Halakti, the creator of light, and fully destroys Zork once and for all. With Zork finally out of the picture, the Pharaoh no longer needs to remain in this world and can move on. However, Yugi needs to defeat him in a ceremonial battle in order for him to do so. And this is their final duel of the series, Atem versus Yugi, meaning that we finally get to see what Yugi has learned from the Pharaoh and if he has just been being carried the entire time. Atem's final deck is pretty similar to what we've seen up to this point, the Face Knights, Dark Magician stuff, and the God cards, all being supported by powerful and tricky spells and traps. But if he has all that stuff in there, then Yugi needs his own deck as well. And we really get to see Yugi's personality shine through this, as most of his cards are built around the idea of games. For example, the Silent Magician and Silent Swordsman, who can level up through the duel. He has red, green, and yellow gadget, block dragons, Marshmallow, and the Magnet Warriors, and these are all kind of toy and childlike. And these are all rounded out by Yugi's new ace monster, Gandora, a powerful dragon that requires sacrificing half of his life points to play, and then removes all monsters from the field and destroys itself as well. And notably, this is a perfect parallel to what this duel is. Yugi is giving up half of himself by letting a Tem move on. He is destroying the life they have built up together, and needs to break down the idea that he can't be complete without the Pharaoh. He is destroying the him that he was and becoming someone new. Once he's able to do this, he can defeat a Tem, and the Pharaoh moves on to the afterlife. And that is where the original series ends, though Yugi does appear in later stories. For example, he, Jaden, and Yusei battle Paradox in Bonds Beyond Time, though he barely plays any cards in that duel. He does play quite a lot in Dark Side of Dimensions though, sticking to these silent cards and gadgets, though he does add in more of the Magician Girl archetype as well, and upgraded versions of cards like Sentry Soldier of Stone, Lord Gaia the Fierce Knight, and Clear Karibo. And finally, he shows up again in GX to give Jaden a winged Karibo, and later to battle him at the end of the series, though we don't see the result. With that done, we can finally get on to Yugi's best friend, Joey Wheeler, who is allegedly the third best duelist in the world according to Pegasus in GX. But he didn't start that way. When he was 10, Joey's parents got divorced and he was separated from his sister, Serenity, as she went on to live with their mother while Joey went to live with their father. And after this, he never spoke to his mother again. From there, Joey becomes a bit insecure and constantly feels the need to prove himself. For example, when he sees a young kid being attacked by a gang of bullies, he steps in to help because he feels like it's the right thing to do and wants to support others. But when Tristan shows up to help him, Joey feels as though he is being babied and looked down on. That said, it wasn't like Joey was always kind and helpful. He and Tristan went on to bully Yugi in school until a bigger bully called Ushio showed up and bullies them. Then it is Yugi who protects the duo by beating Ushio in a punishment game, and from then on, Joey and Tristan end up being friends with Yugi. However, the idea of needing to appear strong follows through when Yugi teaches Joey about duel monsters, as he builds a deck almost entirely about monster cards because he wants to just put out the biggest and baddest guys possible. Luckily, Yugi helps him get over this pretty quick, but Yugi's not the only one who mentors Joey in the game, as he studies under Solomon Moto as well, to the point where he manages to reach the top 8 in a regional tournament in the Japanese version of the series. And it's a good thing he got so much better so quickly, as soon Pegasus steals Solomon Moto's soul, and Yugi is forced to travel to Duelist Kingdom to save him, meaning that it's Joey's turn to repay his debt by following him onto the island to compete as well. Though he is also trying to earn prize money to pay for his sister's surgery that will cure her blindness. Alright, so let's talk about Joey's deck going into Duelist Kingdom. Despite being all about appearing strong, Joey's deck is kind of on the weaker end overall. He uses mostly Warrior and Beast Warrior monsters, with a few of his most powerful cards being Flame Swordsman, Giltia, and Garuzis. Problem is, this is Duelist Kingdom, and there isn't really tribute summoning yet, so when an opponent can drop a Blue Eyes in response to his Flame Swordsman, he can kinda get outclassed very quickly. Luckily, his deck is supplemented by cards he is given. He gets Time Wizard from Yugi, and that lets him transform his baby dragon into a Thousand Dragon, while also giving him a chance to destroy some of the most dangerous monsters that he comes across. He gets Lava Battle Guard from Tristan, that boosts his own Swamp Battle Guard to create a decently strong duo. And he wins a Red Eyes Black Dragon from Rex, which becomes his new ace monster. And here's where Joey differs from Yugi. Yugi's deck is made up so that he can always combo out of any situation by creating a clever solution, which he can do because he is skilled and knowledgeable at the game. He's still learning the game and his deck is barely fully built, so instead, he soaks up what he can from others. Be that by getting gifted cards or taking an opponent's strategy and using it against them, which he can do with cards like Copycat or Grave Robber to steal their cards, Time Wizard to fossilize or age them, and Sword and Shield to exploit weaknesses of monsters that are solely based on attack and have no defense. And despite often being seen as a bit of a joke, this lets him defeat some really decent players. In Duelist Kingdom, he manages to beat Mai Valentine despite her cheating, Rex Raptor despite him being a professional level player, Bones, despite Bandit Keith coaching him throughout the match, the Paradox brothers, who change how the game is played, and then Bandit Keith himself, who, like Mai, was also cheating. That said, he does lose to both Kaiba and Yugi, but so does everyone, and even so, that is still a seriously impressive track record for someone just learning the game. This unfortunately makes him a bit overconfident though, and after getting runner-up in Duelist Kingdom, he is goaded into a duel with Duke Devlin. In this match, they draft decks from booster packs, and Joey is completely destroyed. And this loss streak continues as we go into Battle City, as in his first duel, Joey plays against Seeker, who cheats by using multiple copies of Exodia to win.
and ultimately Joey loses his red eyes as a result. Notably, despite Joey constantly going against cheaters, this is the only time he really loses to one. For example, his following matches against Esperoba and then Weevil. Espa has his siblings spying on Joey's hand, while Weevil sneaks in a Parasite into his deck for an advantage. And in both cases, Joey is able to outmaneuver these issues and come out ahead regardless, earning him some pretty powerful cards that he can use for the rest of the tournament. He then takes on Mako Tsunami, the only fair match that he has throughout all of Battle City to this point, and ultimately wins, earning his spot in the finals. And this is probably a pretty good spot to talk about Joey's Battle City deck. Interestingly enough, while he still does focus on warrior cards, Joey's deck is now more spells and traps than it is monsters. Sure, he has some notable additions like Panther Warrior, Rocket Warrior, and the cards he wins from his opponents like Jinzo, Insect Queen, and Legendary Fisherman, but now he is more experienced in the game and has built up a really solid set of support cards to help those creatures out, which is important since he doesn't have red eyes anymore. Cards like Pot of Greed, Monster Reborn, Foolish Burial, and Giant Trunade are just fantastic cards in general. But we also add in some defensive cards like Scapegoat and Magical Arm Shield. But the biggest update to his deck is gambling cards. In Duelist Kingdom, Time Wizard was such a banger for him that in Battle City, he fully leans into that theme. Skull Dice and Graceful Dice are genuinely broken battle traps in the anime that can multiply or divide monsters' attacks, rather than adding or subtracting a few hundred like their real-world counterparts. Roulette Spider could force a monster to attack another monster at random, and Gamble could either get him some decent card draw or skip his next turn entirely. And honestly, I think that his relying on these inconsistent gamble cards is probably what makes people think he's such a bad player. But more often than not, it works out for him, so who's to say? Despite all that though, he makes his way to the top 8, beats Odeon, and then also beats Marik, or at least he should have. Because the game ends up being a shadow game, Joey takes all the damage that his monsters do and is so injured that he faints as he is about to declare the final attack of the game. Regardless, he earned the win, but does get a loss overall. And then Kaiba beats him afterwards when Joey asks to find out who third place for the tournament should be, meaning that Joey ends his final canon match in a loss. That said, overall he still has a super impressive record. Since setting foot on Duelist Kingdom, he has only lost to Kaiba and Yugi when it comes to fair matches, as well as Marik where he should have won, and then also wins against 5 people who are blatantly cheating against him. Otherwise, Joey is surprisingly good at the game, though Téa still is 4-0 against him though, so take from that what you will. Moving on to Waking the Dragons, and that arc doesn't do a whole lot for Joey. He is selected to be one of the legendary warriors like Yugi was, but rather than Timaeus, he plays with Hermos, which lets him fuse his cards into things like Big Bang Dragon Blow, Red Eyes Black Dragon Sword, Time Magic Hammer, and Rocket Hermos Cannon, as well as adding in some ritual cards like Lord of the Red and Knight of Dark Dragon. Outside of that though, there's also a further focus on luck, and in a battle against Valen, they both wear power armor cards, which is a bit of a banger, but regardless, again, this is a filler arc, so we don't gotta stay here too long. Similarly, the Grand Championship is also a filler arc and adds more luck, but this has a bigger focus on low-level cards and an entire set of Landstar cards to go along with the Swordsman. This includes Grappler, Knight, and Brigadier of Landstar in tandem with a few Landstar spells. And I am convinced that this was solely done to be anti-Joey propaganda because it is brutal to see these cards in his deck. Following Joey, we have Solomon Moto, Yugi's grandfather that was an archaeologist who had been searching for the tomb of the nameless pharaoh. He hired some guides to bring him through, and together they try to solve the riddles that protect the tomb. However, Mushara fell to his death, and Ahmet betrays Solomon, knocking him from a bridge that he was barely able to cling to. Ahmet goes on and triggers a trap which summons a monster that devours him, and just as Solomon's grip is about to give out, Atem's spirit shows up and lifts him from the pit to save his life. And this is ultimately where Solomon finds the Millennium Puzzle. Solomon was an extremely adventurous man, but he also was very proud and confident in his ability, to the point that he vowed that if he ever lost a game of any kind, he would give up on adventuring and settle down to open a game store. That eventually happened, and he sets up Kame Game. He eventually had a son and a grandson named Yugi. However, one day Solomon would be approached by his friend Arthur Hawkins to join him on an expedition to Egypt. While there, the two discovered that the Duel Monsters game actually originated from the ancient Egyptian shadow games. As they continued to explore, the site caved in and the two were stuck, and with very little water, Arthur suggests that they have a duel to see who would get the last of it. And despite being able to win, Solomon surrenders in hopes that his friend would be able to survive. Luckily, Rescuers arrive just in time to save them, and as a thank you, Arthur gifted Solomon with his prized possession, a Blue Eyes White Dragon card. And he held onto this card for years until he was approached by Seto Kaiba. Kaiba was in possession of the only 3 other Blue Eyes in existence, and wished to take Solomon's card as well. The old man refused, and so Kaiba challenges him to a duel for ownership of it. Luckily, we've already talked about his deck in this duel, as Yugi's original deck throughout Duelist Kingdom was inherited from Solomon in this match. However, unlike Yugi, Solomon couldn't defeat Kaiba, and the duel is so brutal that he ends up being hospitalized afterwards. Kaiba then takes his Blue Eyes and tears it up, explaining that there can only be 3 copies in his own deck, and that by destroying the only remaining copy, he can guarantee that Blue Eyes will never be used against him. And yes, Yugi goes on to avenge him by defeating Kaiba, however Solomon doesn't get to celebrate very long, as soon Pegasus steals his soul in order to lure Yugi to Duelist Kingdom. After being saved, Solomon doesn't really play a major role in the rest of the series, though he does show up a bit to give advice to Joey throughout a lot of Battle City. However, he does make a bit of an appearance in the Grand Championship filler arc. Here he returns as Mask the Rock, or Apnarg Otum, depending on the version, to take part in the Kaiba Corp Grand Prix so that he can prove he can still duel. Here he uses the Ancient deck, which focuses on rock monsters like Ancient Dragon, Ancient Giant, and Ancient City. This extends to other archaeological themes like the Wandering Mummy, but Arthur notes here that Solomon is the only person to ever summon the Ancient Dragon, bringing back the theme of him putting Exodia in his prior deck. On top of that, he also uses this duel as a way of testing Joey's reliance on luck by including cards like Ordeal of a Traveler and the legendary Gambler.
Alright, back to the big ones, and we have Seto Kaiba, the reincarnation of Priest Seto, who was Atem's cousin and the keeper of the Blue Eyes White Dragon spirit. Much like Priest Seto, Kaiba also grew up without parents. Both of his parents passed away while he was very young, and his remaining family stole everything from his parents' will, leaving Kaiba and his younger brother Mokuba to live alone at an orphanage. Mokuba had been extremely upset by this, which fair, and so Kaiba had to step up, promising to take care of his brother no matter what happened going forward, and to that end, he refused to show any kind of weakness from that point on. There were several potential parents who wanted to adopt Seto because he was a genius, but he refused all of them as none of them were willing to take his brother with them. But one day, the orphanage received a visit from the head of Kaiba Corp, Goaburo Kaiba, who was doing a publicity stunt, and while he was there, Seto challenged him to a game of chess, saying that if he won, then Goaburo would need to adopt both he and Mokuba. Goaburo, of course, refused, but then Kaiba goaded him on, saying that he would tell everyone how the big bad businessman was afraid of losing against a child. This gets Goaburo to agree to the game, however, Seto had studied his chess strategy leading up to this visit, and so he completely dunks on the man, and he and his brother get adopted. However, this actually worked for Goaburo's plans. He wanted to use Seto as a new host body for his other son Noah, who had been injured and was only being kept alive in virtual reality. However, as time passed, he saw that Seto had more potential than Noah did, and so he slowly abandoned his actual son to focus on training his adopted one. He made Seto study all forms of business, economic and social studies, foreign languages, and game theory to ensure that he would be the perfect successor, though he was doing a bit too good of a job. Goaburo eventually asked what Seto planned to do with Kaiba Corp once he inherited it, and Seto explained that he wanted to build Kaiba Land, a theme park for underprivileged children. Goaburo dismissed this idea outright though, arguing that games were useless because they couldn't be used to control people. Despite Seto insisting that games had value, Goaburo then ordered Hobson to confiscate all of Seto's toys, effectively cutting off any gaming from him entirely. However, Mokuba took steps to ensure that Seto had something, hiding his Duel Monsters deck inside of a hollowed-out book, along with a drawing of a Blue Eyes White Dragon, and a note reminding Seto that their family couldn't take everything from them. And when he sees this, Seto vows that one day he will own a real Blue Eyes to honor this. And that brings us up to Seto's birthday, where things begin to change. Goaburo gifted Seto with a 2% share of Kaiba Corp, or about $10 million in the dub, and explains that he had 1 year to repay 100 times that amount, and if he couldn't, then the boys would be sent back to the orphanage. But despite being given a full year, it only takes Kaiba a single day. He buys 51% of a company that deeply cared for its employees and then approaches the president of that company,
and said that he would close the business down if he wasn't paid back the full amount he needed to win his father's wager. Soon after, Seto developed advanced virtual reality software meant for gaming, but Goaburo decides that it would be better used for warfare. And when Seto confronts him for this, Goaburo once again dismisses games as pointless, insisting that Kaiba Corp only existed to dominate enemies and accumulate power. And this was the breaking point where Seto realizes that if Goaburo stays in control, then his technology would be used to kill people for profit, and so he decides to take Kaiba Corp over for himself. To do this, he cuts a deal with the Big Five, promising them respect and influence once Goaburo is gone. Together, they quietly acquire 49% of Kaiba Corp, leaving Goaburo with 49% as well, and Mokuba holding the remaining 2%. Seto deliberately lets Goaburo discover the idea, and even lets Mokuba be framed as the one who leaks it, seemingly turning the brothers against each other. Goaburo then planned on using his 49% plus Mokuba's share to regain control of the company, but Mokuba ultimately sides with Seto, handing his 2% over and giving Seto the majority. Now with 51% of the company, Seto takes control of Kaiba Corp, and unable to accept the loss, Goaburo takes his own life, though not before secretly uploading his consciousness into Noah's virtual world. After taking control, Seto immediately shifts the company away from weapons manufacturing and towards games and entertainment technology. The Big Five quickly realize that they aren't getting the power or respect that they had been promised. Kaiba refused to fund Crump's Penguin theme park, forced Nesbit to prove his loyalty by destroying the company's military factory on Alcatraz, and then once that was done, shut down the military division altogether, and in its place he began developing the Duel Tower, which we would see in Battle City. Nesbit was then demoted to a logistics worker for the project, and in the dub, Lecter was stripped of his authority as well. At the same time, Kaiba began working on Kaiba Land. But alongside this, he also began developing holographic technology to elevate Duel Monsters beyond anything that existed at the time. This brought him into contact with Maximillion Pegasus, who invites Kaiba as a special guest to the Intercontinental Duel Monsters tournament in New York, where Kaiba watches him embarrass Bandit Keith by giving written instructions to a random child in the audience. The child then goes on to beat Bandit Keith with these instructions, and Kaiba begins to suspect that Pegasus might be able to read minds somehow. To combat this, he began designing the Duel Disc, hoping that by forcing duelists to stand apart from each other and rely on holographic projections instead of sitting face to face, he could counter Pegasus's abilities. At the same time, Kaiba goes on to become the Duel Monsters World Champion and collects 3 of the 4 Blue Eyes White Dragons that exist. Luckily for him, he overhears Yugi talking about his grandfather's rare card, and so he shows up to Kame Game, offering to trade anything for Solomon's Blue Eyes, and then he challenges the old man to a duel when he refuses. Kaiba manages to beat the old man, and then rips up the remaining Blue Eyes so that it can never be used against him. This upsets Yugi, fairly, and he takes Kaiba on to avenge his grandfather and then manages to assemble Exodia for the win, after which Yugi uses Mind Crush to banish the evil that is inside of Kaiba. At this point, Kaiba takes a break from Duel Monsters and re-examines himself, which is interrupted when Pegasus works with the Big Five to try and take over the company, by means of sending 2 men into Kaiba's office to capture him, and when he fights back, they try and shoot him. To which, Kaiba performs a Jason Bourne-style escape, though his deck is stolen in the chaos. He eventually breaks back into Kaiba Corp and learns what happened, as well as that Mokuba has been captured and taken prisoner by Pegasus. So Kaiba tries to hack into Duelist Kingdom's computer and finds that an imposter of him is using his deck to battle Yugi. And while Kaiba doesn't like Yugi, he hates Pegasus. So he uses the virus to weaken the imposter's Blue Eyes and helps Yugi win. Immediately afterwards, Kaiba makes his way to Duelist Kingdom with his duel discs, whoops Joey in a duel for fun, jams a gun with a playing card, breaks into Pegasus' prison to find Mokuba, and then is told he would only be given a chance to save his brother's soul if he beats Yugi in a duel, earning an opportunity to duel Pegasus afterwards. So, Kaiba challenges Yugi to a rematch, and threatens to jump off the castle if Yugi beats him, which leads to Yugi surrendering. This means that he can take on Pegasus, but thanks to his Millennium Eye, Kaiba doesn't really stand a chance, and as a result, Kaiba's soul is sealed away as well, until Yugi beats Pegasus later. After which, Kaiba thanks Yugi and promises to have a fair duel in the future. So, a few things to point out here. Firstly, the extremely prideful Kaiba is willing to effectively beg his opponent for a win, and even threatens taking his own life to protect his younger brother, which is great. And second, despite seeing the Millennium Eye in use and having his brother's soul be taken, and his own soul be taken, he still holds that all of the magic in the series is mumbo jumbo, which is a bold position to have at this point in the story. But that said, let's finally talk about Kaiba's first deck. Interestingly, at its core, Kaiba's first deck is a lot like Joey's, in that it heavily focuses on high stat monsters, though while Joey's kind of peak around 1800 and later 2400, Kaiba's reach up to 3000 with the 3 Blue Eyes White Dragons. Then of course he can fuse them together into the Blue Eyes Ultimate Dragon, showing his dedication to power as the strongest creature in the game at this point. However, he also has a much bigger focus on spells and traps than Joey did. Monster Reborn, Negate Attack, the Flute of Summoning Dragon, and most iconically, the Crush card Virus. This trap lets Kaiba sacrifice a weak monster to destroy every card with 1500 or more attack on their opponent's field, as well as in their hand and their deck. This is super cool as it shows how Kaiba thinks. He is all about power, and he expects his opponents to be the same, so removing an opponent's strongest monsters should be enough to stop them in their tracks. And this is why he struggles against opponents like Pegasus and Yugi, who fight with creative options and even make use of weaker monsters pretty regularly, as this is very difficult for Kaiba to deal with when they're just working on different axes altogether. And this is only amplified in Battle City. An Egyptian history exhibit comes to Domino, and Kaiba is invited to come check it out by Ishizu Ishtar. When he arrives, she uses the Millennium Necklace to show Kaiba visions of an ancient sorcerer battling the Pharaoh using duel monsters, those being of course Priest Seto and Atem. Ishizu explains that while 2 of the Egyptian god cards were stolen, she still has Obelisk the Tormentor, which she gives to Kaiba in exchange for him hosting a Duel Monsters tournament, with the hopes that he will lure out the other 2 cards in this way. To this end, the tournament would have an ante-system where the duelist needs to offer up their rarest card in each game. And while Kaiba doesn't believe in any of the ancient Egyptian stuff, he is interested in collecting the god cards and the opportunity to duel Yugi again. His new deck has a lot of overlap with his previous one, though we are adding in things like Thunder Dragons, the XYZ Dragon Cannon cards, and of course Obelisk the Tormentor, a card which can reach infinite power by sacrificing 2 others. This was comboed with new supporting spells and traps like Lullaby of Obedience, Enemy Controller, Virus Cannon, and the Rings of Destruction and Defense. The game plan has become all about removing opponents' cards while protecting his own so that he can accumulate enough monsters to summon Obelisk. We don't get too much of Kaiba dueling early on in this tournament outside of him devastating a few randoms to test out his new god card, though he does make 2 notable appearances. First of which is him watching Yugi duel strings, where Yugi is pushed into a corner, and Kaiba gives him a pep talk that basically comes down to, "My rival can't lose to a dweeb like this." Again, showing how much Kaiba actually respects Yugi despite the airs that he puts on. And second, when Mokuba is kidnapped, again, Kaiba pairs up with Yugi for a tag duel against Loomis and Umbra, where Kaiba actually sacrifices his blue eyes to save Yugi, and then the 2 work together so that he can summon Obelisk. With that though, we're going to jump forward to the semi-finals of the tournament where Kaiba takes on Ishizu, who notably is pretty similar to Pegasus. She can't actually read Kaiba's mind, but she can see the future, which works functionally the same in a duel. And so she has built an entire deck specifically designed to defeat Kaiba, including a trap card called Sacrifice's Blast to essentially win instantly if Kaiba attacks with Obelisk. And Kaiba even summons Obelisk in this match, but the Millennium Rod, which used to belong to Priest Seto thousands of years ago, intervenes and calls out to Seto and reveals a stone carving of the Blue Eyes from the past, and so Kaiba sacrifices Obelisk to summon the dragon, ultimately allowing him to win the match. And this moment solidifies the difference between Kaiba and Yugi. Yugi uses the heart of the cards in the Millennium Puzzle to manipulate fate in his favor, whereas Kaiba's connection to Blue Eyes allows him to overcome fate. Though again, despite experiencing the magic firsthand, he still refuses to acknowledge it. And this is pushed even further when he is one of the only people able to read the Winged Dragon of Ra, while no other normal people are able to do so. After this, we have the Noah arc, but we're gonna finish up Battle City first. Soon, Kaiba and Yugi meet in the semi-finals where Slifer and Obelisk clash and destroy each other, causing a flashback where they each witness a duel between Priest Seto and Atem from the past. Though soon after this, Yugi manages to win the duel using Dark Paladin and Diffusion Wave Motion, meaning that Kaiba needs to give up Obelisk. However, he does at least beat Joey shortly after, so that's something. Around here, Yugi tells Kaiba that he has become obsessed with hatred and the need to win, and says that even if he could win, he would be alone at the top with nothing but his hate to accompany him. Kaiba originally rejects this, but Mokuba starts crying and says that his brother doesn't duel for fun anymore, and is playing the game for all the wrong reasons. This makes Kaiba reevaluate, and he chooses to help Atem, giving him the Fiend Sanctuary card, which ends up assisting a lot in him beating Marik. Okay, but back to the virtual world arc that we skipped. Basically, there's a detour before the semifinals where everyone is dragged into the virtual world that Noah and Goaburo were stuck inside. Noah tries to win Seto's body and even beats his adopted brother in a duel, but ultimately Yugi steps in to finish things for him. However, Kaiba does get a chance to take on Goaburo here, who is using a corrupted version of Exodia, called Exodia Necros, and in beating him, Kaiba is able to overcome the trauma that Goaburo left on him, as well as the trauma from losing to Yugi in the past. Kaiba actually plays a pretty large role in the following filler arcs as well. Firstly, in Waking the Dragons, he is selected to be the hero connected to the Fang of Critias, and is confronted by Alistar, a boy who lost his brother to a war that was being supplied by Kaiba Corp. When Alistar accuses Kaiba of being evil as a result of this, Kaiba's response is basically to say, hey man, sorry to hear that your brother was blown up by a tank. If it was my brother who was going to be blown up by a tank though, I would simply make sure that my brother wasn't blown up by a tank. So to me, it just sounds like you're a bad brother. Which, Jesus Christ, that is so metal. He goes on to help Atem take on Darts, but loses his soul and needs to be saved by the Pharaoh afterwards, which is tradition at this point. Then, in the Grand Championship arc, he takes part in a tournament being hosted by Siegfried von Schroeder, who is basically just another rich kid who is jealous of Kaiba. Like I said, all this filler stuff doesn't super matter, though Kaiba does summon Chaos Emperor Dragon, which is pretty rad. After all of that, Kaiba goes on to help with the Pharaoh's memory arc, as well as offers to battle Atem to free his soul, but he is ultimately refused so that Yugi can take on Atem himself. Now, Kaiba is actually one of the few characters to actually make an impact in later series as well. He owns the Duel Academy in GX, he launches cards into space in hopes of teaching aliens how to duel so they can beat them, and accidentally creates Yubel in the process, and he wagers the school in a bet against Slade and Jagger Princeton just for fun. Kaiba Corp is also still around in 5Ds as well, and they're responsible for turning Domino City into New Domino, though Kaiba's involvement is unclear at this point. Finally, I do want to mention in the Dark Side of Dimensions that Kaiba is so obsessed with dueling Atem again that he creates a reality warping duel disc, digs up and tries to rebuild the Millennium Puzzle, and rips a hole in space-time to reach the Pharaoh, which is average Kaiba behavior at this point. But now that we've covered some of the most involved characters, let's get into Téa, who is not only technically a duelist, but who also is pretty much the only character with multiple duels that has a 100% win rate. While Yugi is teaching Joey how to play, Téa has 5 games against him and wins all 5 of them, so she has some decent potential at the game at the very least. Now, Téa is a childhood friend of Yugi and is often kind of the heart of their friend group. For example, she draws the symbol of friendship on the gang's hands before Yugi goes into Duel Kaiba. Like Joey, Téa tags along with Yugi to Duelist Kingdom and is almost entirely moral support there. However, of note, as Yugi becomes Atem more often, Téa stops seeing him as a younger brother and more of an equal, and even more sometimes. Her big moment in Duelist Kingdom is after Yugi melts down when Atem is willing to kill Kaiba to win their duel. Yugi is unable to get his shit together, and so Téa steps up to duel Mai and win Yugi enough star chips to enter the finals. Téa's deck for this is all about light and fairy monsters, with powerhouses like Happy Lover, Petite Angel, and Shining Friendship. But at least she had Magician of Faith as well. That's a real card, that's pretty good. Notably, Mai could have won this duel, but chooses to let Téa win so that she can give Yugi the star chips he needs. Outside of that, Téa's just kinda around for the rest of the arc, and for most of Battle City. She does go on a date with Atem, and she gets possessed by Marik for a bit. She also has one more duel, though it is in a filler arc, as she takes on Crump in the virtual world. Here she uses Dark Magician Girl as her deck master, again connecting her to Yugi, and again her deck is mostly light monsters, adding a few elves, Mahavilo, and the Unhappy Maiden. Téa is one of the few characters we're given an update on at the end of Dark Side of Dimensions, where she leaves the gang so that she can travel and learn more about dance. Now, a duelist with a bit more recognition in their world, but somehow less in ours, is Rex Raptor. Rex was the runner-up at the Japanese National Duel Championship, and was invited to Duelist Kingdom by Pegasus as a result. He was given his own private room on the cruise there, though he lost it almost immediately in a duel to Mai. He ends up getting relentlessly teased over Mai having more star chips than him soon into the actual event, and so he seeks her out to challenge her for a rematch, which she agrees to if he can beat Joey. Now, Rex's dinosaur deck pretty handedly outmuscles Joey's deck, with plenty of stronger monsters. In particular, Rex uses dinosaurs like Arabi and Two-Headed King Rex, and powerful dragons like Serpent Knight Dragon, and of course his Red Eyes Black Dragon that he spent his life savings to get a hold of. which is unfortunate as he ends up losing it to Joey after they place a wager on their match. And Rex doesn't do all that much better in Battle City, where he is immediately defeated by Esperoba, though of course Espa was cheating. However, we do have to step away from Rex's story for a moment, as his is basically tied to Weevil's going forward, so we're just gonna do them together. With that said, it is time for Bug Boy. While Rex was the runner-up at the National Championships, Weevil was the actual winner. However, Rex mentions that both he let Weevil win and that Weevil was stacking his deck, though that is all unconfirmed overall. That said, I mean, pick a story. Did you let him win or was he cheating? Either way, Weevil uses an insect deck. In particular, his strategy involves leveling up a larva moth into a great moth, which is a very slow process but results in a powerful boss monster. Otherwise, he also powers up other smaller insects by equipping spells to them, which gives them a power boost. And if that's not enough, he is always willing to cheat. Weevil gets invited to Duelist Kingdom just like Rex, but along the way he pretends to be a big fan of Yugi's so that he can take a look through his deck, rifle through it, and find the Exodia pieces so that he can throw them into the ocean to stop Yugi from using them against him in the tournament. Once they land, Weevil lures Yugi into a forest as he learned the rules for Duelist Kingdom ahead of time and specifically found a location that would give all of his monsters a power boost so that he could overwhelm Yugi. Despite this, Yugi still wins, and the national champ ends up being the first person kicked out of Duelist Kingdom. Like Rex, Weevil returns in Battle City, though he actually gets an on-screen duel, that being against Joey. However, he again tries to sabotage his opponent's deck by having a kid sneak a copy of Parasite into Joey's deck. And that's a good time to talk about Weevil's Battle City deck. The Parasite turns all of Joey's monsters into insects, which are unable to attack once Weevil sets up Insect Barrier, and makes all of Joey's monsters vulnerable to the Eradicating Aerosol. Beyond the spells, Weevil also adds in the Perfectly Ultimate Great Moth, the Direct Attacking Leghoul, and the Insect Queen, which lays eggs and becomes stronger as more insects fill the board. Even so, Weevil loses the match and his Insect Queen as a result. From there, it wouldn't be until Waking the Dragons that Rex and Weevil would get their chance at redemption. Sort of. They get their souls stolen by Garimo, but later freed by Yugi. However, they end up making a deal with Darts and are given pieces of the Orichalcos stone, as well as access to Darts' card collection before going out for revenge, with Weevil challenging Yugi and Rex challenging Joey. Weevil's new deck is fairly similar in theme to the Battle City one. He's still making use of Insect Barrier, but now he's using DNA Surgery rather than relying on sneaking a copy of Parasite into his opponent's deck. As for Rex, he's still using Big Bunguses, but now his new boss monster is the Tyrant Dragon. Each of them gets beaten pretty handedly by the protagonists after being confronted by how their failures are their own fault and not Yugi and Joey's. Also, we get the Monstacado scene, which is kinda rad. Their souls end up getting captured and sent back to Darts and are later freed when Yugi stops Darts in the end of the season. The two also make the return for the Kaiba Corp Grand Championship, where they pretend to be Fortune Salim. It's the whole two duelists in a trench coat routine. But even together, they lose pretty badly to Siegfried. From there, they go on to take one final chance at revenge on Yugi by stealing the god cards from his house. But they end up stealing all the Millennium Items instead, making them a target for Bakura, who promptly sends them to the Shadow Realm. However, they are saved shortly afterwards, and that's kind of all for these two in the story. But not all villains are, well, Rex and Weevil. Some of them are absolutely iconic and more than a little flamboyant. That's right, next up is Maximillion Pegasus. When he was 10, Pegasus met a young girl named Cecilia at a party that his father was throwing for him. The two ended up falling in love and even got married. However, she unfortunately died when she was 17. Yes, I know, don't focus on it. Keep moving. Pegasus became obsessed with the idea of finding a way to resurrect his wife and eventually made his way to Egypt, where he had began studying the afterlife, which led him to crossing paths with Shadi, a spirit who was guarding the Millennium Items. Shadi warned him outright that this place wouldn't give him back what he was looking for and told him to turn back. But when he realized that Pegasus wouldn't leave, he put him through the trial for the Millennium Eye, promising that if Pegasus was deemed worthy, he would be able to see Cecilia once again. Test ended with Shadi forcibly implanting the Millennium Eye in Pegasus's left eye, and for a brief moment, Pegasus saw his wife and was able to hold her before the vision faded. After gaining the eye, Pegasus learned about the shadow games that had been played in ancient Egypt and became consumed with their power. When he returned to America, he founded Industrial Illusions and created the Duel Monsters card game based on those ancient duels. And notably, by combining these cards with the magic from Millennium Items, a true shadow game could be produced, just as they were in ancient Egypt. On a later trip, Shadi guided Pegasus to a hidden underground city and showed him carvings depicting the Egyptian gods. Pegasus returned home and recreated them as the god cards. However, everyone that he hired to assist in the project either died or disappeared, but he pressed on anyways and chose to paint the cards personally. As he worked, Pegasus began having visions of an ancient city being destroyed by the gods, and Shadi appeared again, warning him that this power that he was meddling with would lead to catastrophe and that the only way out was to return the cards to where they belonged. Fearing for his life, Pegasus returned to Egypt and had Ishizu Ishtar hide the gods away in the pharaoh's tomb. Around the same time period, he also traveled through parts of East Asia, drawing inspiration from local beliefs and mythology, which later influenced the creation of spirit monster cards. Soon, Pegasus also received a proposal from Seto Kaiba to develop a large-scale dueling arena to enhance Duel Monsters by using holographic technology. Shortly after, Pegasus competed in the International Duel Monsters Championship, where he faced Bandit Keith in the finals. Rather than taking the duel seriously, Pegasus used the Millennium Eye to read his opponent's mind. He then wrote down a set of instructions and handed them to a child named Sam, and by following them, the kid was able to easily beat and humiliate Bandit Keith. Pegasus later appeared at the regional Duel Monsters tournament in Japan, where he personally awarded the prize to the winner, Weevil Underwood, going on to invite both Weevil to compete in his upcoming Duelist Kingdom tournament. That said, prior to the tournament actually beginning, Pegasus meets and duels Duke Devlin, who created his own game called Dungeon Dice Monsters, and received approval from Pegasus, as well as a promise to mentor Duke and help with his game's release. Pegasus was eventually informed that Seto Kaiba had been beaten by a kid named Yugi Muto, and seeing that as an opportunity, he struck a deal with the Big Five in an attempt to remove Kaiba and seize control of Kaiba Corp. He also intended to use Kaiba Corp's solid vision technology to recreate Cecilia as a holographic being, or to outright revive her using the Millennium Items depending on the version. And that leads us back to Yugi, who has the Millennium Puzzle. Pegasus sends him a videotape along with all the materials needed to enter the tournament. Through the tape and his Millennium Eye, he's able to communicate with Yugi directly and challenges him to a timed duel. Pegasus wins and stole the soul of Yugi's grandfather to force him to enter Duelist Kingdom if he wants to save his grandfather's soul. At the same time, Pegasus sends his men after Kaiba, but Kaiba escapes, making it appear as though he jumped to his own death. The agents then kidnap Mokuba, who had swallowed a key containing documents Pegasus needed to take over the company, and in the dub, Mokuba is also targeted because he would inherit the company if Seto was gone. Kaiba eventually reaches Duelist Kingdom and demands for Mokuba's release, to which Pegasus responded by sealing the kid's soul inside of a soul prison card and told Kaiba that the only way to get him back was to defeat Pegasus in a duel. He is consistent, if nothing else. Kaiba agreed immediately, but Pegasus reminded him that this was a tournament and tournament rules still applied. He would need 10 star chips to challenge him directly. So Pegasus returned the 5 star chips that Mokuba had previously stolen and told Kaiba to earn the rest by beating Yugi. Kaiba does exactly that and prepared to duel Pegasus using duel discs, which he had designed specifically to counter Pegasus's mind reading, and ultimately Pegasus agrees to use them on the condition that Mokuba's body would be fitted with the discs instead of himself. But Kaiba refused to risk his brother's life, and so he had to duel Pegasus in a standard arena instead. That said, with the Millennium Eye letting him read Kaiba's thoughts, Pegasus easily defeats him and seals Kaiba's soul in yet another soul prison card. Pegasus goes on to watch the rest of the finals, gets held at gunpoint by Bandit Keith, and then drops him into the ocean through a trapdoor. Yugi wins his way through the tournament and earns the right to battle Pegasus, with the conditions being that if Yugi wins, then Pegasus's hostages would be released, but if Pegasus wins, he would claim Yugi's soul and his Millennium Item. At first, Pegasus has a massive advantage thanks to the Millennium Eye, but that changes once Yugi and Atem figure out how to counter it. The Mind Shuffle involved them playing their turn and swapping to the other persona without communicating, so that Pegasus wouldn't be able to get a full view of their strategy at any point in time. This worked until Pegasus activated a shadow game, which strained Yugi to the point that he can't stay active, and so Atem is left to face Pegasus alone, and in the end, Pegasus loses regardless. True to his word, a defeated Pegasus retreated to his sanctuary and released the souls of Solomon, Seto, and Mokuba, after which he mourned his failure and spoke to Cecilia, accepting that he wouldn't be able to complete his mission. Not long after, Yami Bakura appears and challenges Pegasus to another shadow game, this time over the Millennium Items. Still weakened from his loss to Yugi and Atem, Pegasus is defeated almost immediately, which allows Bakura to rip the Millennium Eye out of Pegasus's head and leaves him in a coma. Before continuing, let's first cover Pegasus's first deck. This is one of the more strange decks in the series, in that it has two completely distinct and separate themes in it. First, and most iconic, is probably the Toon World theme. Pegasus loves cartoons, and half of his deck is dedicated to these nearly indestructible, goofy little guys, but he will also take and transform his opponent's cards into toons as well, like he did with Blue Eyes and Summon Skull. The second theme is vaguely based around ancient sorcery and millennium magic. You'll often see the Eye of Anubis, or just eyes in general, on a lot of his creatures. Dark Eyes Illusionist, Illusionist Faceless Mage, and of course, Relinquished and Thousand Eyes Restrict. Now, as you might imagine, being in a coma really stops Pegasus from being active in much of the story going forward, but he does play a role in the Pyramid of Light movie, as well as a small amount in Waking the Dragons and the Kaiba Corp Grand Championship, but nothing particularly worth getting into. However, Pegasus does return for Yu-Gi-Oh! GX. Firstly, he hires Chumley to work as a card designer, and then when a dude named Franz steals a copy of the Winged Dragon of Ra from Industrial Illusions, both Pegasus and Chumley return to Duel Academy to track it down. Interestingly, Pegasus also has a triangle duel against Crowler and Bonaparte in GX, where he turns them against each other and easily overwhelms them. As for his deck at this point, he has dropped all of the Relinquished and Illusion stuff and has purely focused on tunes at this point. Pegasus is also heavily featured in Bonds Beyond Time, or at least so much as that he is targeted by Paradox, who is trying to kill Pegasus to erase Duel Monsters from existence and to stop Synchro Summoning from destroying the future. Now, before I move on, I do just want to quickly mention that Pegasus makes a pretty interesting appearance in one of the Yu-Gi-Oh! Video games as well, specifically being Reshef of Destruction, where he finds an ancient stone tablet and is possessed by Reshef the Dark Being. He then starts calling himself Sol Chevalsky, and real quick, who the hell designed this brutal game? It's so bad to play. On to yet another fan favorite with Mai Valentine. Mai grew up largely on her own. In the original version, she was orphaned at a young age, while in the dub, her parents were constantly absent due to work. Either way, she needed to learn to take care of herself without relying on anyone else. Before entering the competitive dueling scene, Mai worked as a card dealer on a casino ship. It was there that she found the Harpy Ladies and began to build decks around them. While working, she was constantly surrounded by men that she found dull and predictable, many of whom assumed that their money entitled them to her attention. And Mai completely used this to her advantage. She would spray her cards with different perfumes, and it made her seem like she had psychic abilities which allowed her to predict her draws without looking. Using these aroma-based tricks, she constantly beat her opponents and took their money, but despite the success, she eventually grew bored and walked away from the job. During this time, she also met actor Jean-Claude Magnum, and the two dueled, resulting in Mai winning, but soon after he proposes to her and is rejected, with Mai telling him to come back once he actually becomes a decent duelist. Mai was eventually invited to compete in the Duelist Kingdom tournament, and before even arriving on the island, she manages to defeat Rex Raptor and took his room for herself by using her scented cards. Once on the island, Mai watches Yugi duel Weevil and openly mocks his chances. In particular, she really struggles to understand the value in Yugi's friendships after having grown up so self-reliant. She later faces Joey and again uses her scented cards to play mind games. However, once Joey realizes what she is doing, he exposes her and manages to win the duel. On that note, this is the first time that we really get to take a look at her deck, so let's talk about it. Mai is kind of similar to Kaiba in some ways, in that she is one of the few players early on that runs 3 copies of their favorite card at the center of their deck, and these cards can kind of be combined together. Sort of. In particular, she uses Harpy Lady, which she can enhance with a ton of different equip cards in her deck. Things like Cyber Shield, Rose Whip, and of course, Elegant Egotist, which will turn her Harpy into Harpy Lady sisters. These Harpies can also power up her strongest monster, Harpy's Pet Dragon, and if that isn't enough, she has powerful spells like Harpy's Feather Duster and Mirror Wall as well. And then there's also the fact that she can blatantly cheat early on. That said, once she's found out, Mai stops cheating altogether and relies purely on her own skill instead. Mai went on to win several duels off-screen and was later approached by Rex Raptor for a rematch. She had no intention of dueling against him again, but she still wanted another shot against Joey. But instead of challenging Joey directly, she told Rex to duel him first. Her logic being that if Rex beat Joey and she beat Rex, it would count as beating both of them. But unfortunately for her, Joey wins. Afterward, Mai shares food with Yugi, Joey, and the others, saying that she could be friends for the night and rivals again tomorrow, showing early signs of her beginning to change. That night she was ambushed by Pegasus's Eliminator Panic, and moments later Yugi and his friends arrive to find that she has lost all of her starships. Thankfully, Yugi is able to take Panic down and returns her starships for her, but Mai repays this debt soon after when Yugi lost to Kaiba. She had collected more starships than she needed, and so she offered to give him some of her starships. When Yugi refused, Téa duels Mai for them instead, and despite being able to beat her, Mai surrenders, again demonstrating that she is not as cold or tough as she puts on. In the finals, Mai was matched against Yugi in the first round. At the time, Atem was completely distracted by the idea of dueling Pegasus and reclaiming the stolen souls of Solomon and the Kaiba brothers, and as a result, he wasn't taking Mai seriously. Both Yugi and Mai need to push a Tem to actually focus on the duel. Mai initially forces him into a corner, however, rather than simply finishing him off, she helped Yugi confront his fears of dueling again. Once a Tem takes over with a clear head, he manages to take the win. After her loss, she gives Joey one of her entry cards to prevent him from being disqualified when Bandit Keith steals his. And with Bandit Keith later being disqualified in the tournament, Mai ultimately places 3rd overall. During Battle City, Mai wins enough duels off-screen to qualify for the quarterfinals with her upgraded deck. While she still has her Harpy cards, she largely moved away from them now and is focused on the Amazonas cards around this time, with the overall theme of the deck now being only female cards, and having a decent amount of spells and traps to support each archetype. Before the quarterfinals, Mai runs into Jean-Claude Magnum again, and he challenges her to another duel, raising the stakes by declaring that if he won, she would have to marry him. Mai defeats him pretty easily, but Magnum snapped and attempted to kidnap her using a hang glider. She manages to get away and nearly falls to her death before Joey saves her. Speaking of which, jumping forward to when Joey lost consciousness following his duel with Odeon, while he was out, he dreamed about his friends and that helped him regain consciousness. When Mai asked if she appeared in that dream, Joey lied and said no, which infuriates her. She had put in a ton of work to be more welcoming and accepting of having people in her life and thought that she was important to her new friends as well. But hearing this leaves her feeling isolated and angry, which Marik takes advantage of in their duel. Mai actually manages to control the early part of her duel against Marik. She outplays him pretty well, steals the Winged Dragon of Ra using Amazona's Chainmaster, and puts herself in a winning position. But then he activates a Shadow Game. From that point on, every time one of Mai's monsters was destroyed, she would lose memories of her friends. Near the end of the duel, Mai has 3 Cyber Harpy Ladies on the field and is very close to winning. However, when she attempts to summon Ra, it appears in its sphere mode as she isn't one of the chosen few who can control it. Unable to read the hieratic text and activate Ra properly, she lost control of the card, allowing Marik to reclaim it. As her memories continue to fade, her feelings of loneliness return, even as Yugi tries to encourage her. And just before the end of the duel, Joey runs onto the stage to confront her directly. His words manage to break through Marik's control and restore Mai's memories of him, something that genuinely shocks Marik, who notes that their bond was strong enough to resist his power. However, even in spite of all this, Mai still loses the duel. In the dub, Mai is sent to the Shadow Realm, while in the original version, she is trapped inside of her own mind and subjected to severe mental trauma. Luckily, after Marik's eventual defeat, Yugi frees her. Later, Mai and Bakura, or Mai and Serenity in the anime, pretend to still be unconscious as a prank, causing Joey to panic before Mai finally wakes up, smirks, and laughs at his reaction, showing us that she still values and appreciates her friends at this point going forward. However, after the tournament, Mai parted ways with Joey and the others. Although she finally acknowledged them as her closest friends, she still feels that she needed to move on and find her own path forward. And while I usually skip over the filler arcs for the most part, Waking the Dragons is pretty important for Mai actually. After Battle City, Mai continued dueling on her own and managed to win several smaller tournaments. However, she was constantly overshadowed by Yugi, Kaiba, and Joey, and without her friends around her to ground her, her feelings of losing never really goes away. She was also haunted by recurring nightmares of Yami Marik, and in the dub, she dreams about being trapped in the Shadow Realm forever, while in the original version, she continuously relives being helpless as Marik tries to kill her. Following one of her tournament wins, Mai overheard the runner-up and his friends claiming that it was embarrassing to lose to someone like her, and insisting that she would never measure up to the duelists like Yugi, Kaiba, or Joey, which angers her so much that she shatters the trophy on the spot. Not long after, she meets Valen, and he recognizes her as someone who lived to win and offered to stand by her side, promising to keep winning for her against anyone she wanted, ultimately leading her to fall under Dartz's influence and the power of the Seal of Orichalcos. Following Dartz's orders, Mai ambushes Pegasus and beats him in a duel, and then goes on to trap his soul. All the while, the Seal's influence continues to eat away at her until she is convinced that Yugi, Joey, and the others have abandoned her. She especially fixates on Joey, wanting to defeat him personally this time. When the protagonists arrive at Industrial Illusions expecting to meet Pegasus, they instead find Mai and are trapped inside. Mai duels Joey using the Seal of Orichalcos, putting both of their souls on the line. She was winning at first, but Joey attains his legendary dragon and turns the tables on her. Before she can lose her soul, Valen intervenes and breaks the seal, which saves her. However, she insists she had it under control. And to fully reflect Mai reverting to her isolated and sheltered mindset from before meeting Yugi and Joey, her deck has also reverted, now fully focusing on Harpy cards once again. Valen then tries to defeat Joey himself, but Joey wins and manages to shake Valen's loyalty to Dartz. Mai arrived just in time to see the end of this duel, but was quickly overtaken by the Orichalcos' influence and again challenges Joey once more. Joey accepts, knowing that he couldn't reach her unless she is freed from Darts' control, and exhausted from back-to-back duels, Joey nearly collapses. However, just as she is about to win, she finally sees through the manipulation and rushes to catch him. But this is too late, and the seal takes Joey's soul regardless. Mai held him and begged for the Orichalcos to stop, but before his soul was fully consumed, Joey shoves her away and shatters her fragment of the Orichalcos, freeing her from Darts' control as he loses his soul. Determined to repay both Joey and Valen, Mai tries to confront Darts directly, hoping to win back their souls, but instead she was intercepted and defeated by Raphael and loses her own soul in the process. Raphael later pulls her unconscious body from the collapsing headquarters and saves her life at the end of the arc. After Darts was finally defeated by Yugi, Kaiba, Joey, and Mai's spirits were released alongside Valen's and all the others claimed by the Orichalcos. Riding off on her motorcycle, Mai reflects on how genuine of a friend Joey has always been. She admits that she isn't ready to face him yet and needs time to put herself back together, but promises that one day she would make things right. From there, Mai spends most of the series largely alone and out of the spotlight. She stepped away from the others to reevaluate her life, her choices, and what dueling actually meant to her. In the English dub, she explicitly says that she couldn't face Joey or the rest of the group until she has come to terms with everything that she has done. And before leaving, she gives Valen her Cyber Harpy card and promises that she would return for it someday. Again, in the dub, however, her relationship with Valen appeared to be over, and she leaves it ambiguous whether she would ever reconnect with Joey. And with that, it is time for the Freaky Fish Guy. When Mako Tsunami was young, he and his father went out on a fishing trip, however, they were hit by a brutal storm. Mako's father managed to tie his son to the mast to ensure that he wouldn't fall overboard, but he couldn't secure himself in time, and a massive wave knocked him into the ocean. Here is where the versions of the story differ a little bit between the English and Japanese. In the original story, Mako's father dies, and so Mako dedicates his life to becoming the greatest fisherman to honor him. Meanwhile, in the English, his goal is to find his father, who he believes is simply lost at sea, which he assumes is true as there was a missing lifeboat that he could have survived on. Like Rex and Weevil, Mako ended up getting invited to Duelist Kingdom after his performance at the Japanese Nationals, in which he placed third. Mako ultimately agrees to participate, and in the dub he explains that this is in hopes of winning enough money to buy a boat and search for his father. Yugi finds Mako early on after landing on Duelist Kingdom, and after sharing a meal with the gang, Mako challenges Yugi to a duel, in which he takes advantage of the watery battlefield. You see, Mako's deck is entirely built around water monsters, and when Yugi plays the Full Moon card, it raises the water level high enough that Mako's monsters can hide under the tides and remain protected. Unfortunately for him, Yugi then destroys the moon, leaving Mako's monsters stranded and allowing Yugi to win the match. Mako's deck is probably the one that we actually know least about in the early series, as we don't get to see many of his spells or traps, and only get to see 4 monsters, those being Fiend Kraken, Great White Terror, Kairyushin, and Jellyfish. The guy likes fish. Notably, of all the opponents that Yugi wins star chips from in duels, Mako is the only one who ends up being a decent guy in the end, and they leave each other as friends. Also, like Weevil, Mako returns in Battle City where he battles Joey rather than Yugi. At this point, he has started working at the Domino City Aquarium. Originally, he was trying to catch the killer whale that they had on display there, but he was yelled at by the whale's trainer. The trainer eventually became too sick to work, and so Mako offers to fill in for them. Soon he comes across Joey there, and the two duel to see who will make it to the playoffs of the tournament. This time around, Mako makes use of an upgraded version of his old strategy. He brings the ocean himself with Umi to boost all of his creatures' attacks, and combos it with powerful defensive cards like Tornado Wall and Torrential Tribute. He is also including the ritual monster Fortress Whale, but most importantly, he has the legendary Fisherman card, which he uses in memory of his father, which makes it a bit awkward when Joey wins the duel and takes the card from him. This is unfortunately the last time that Mako makes a relevant appearance in the story, but I feel like I should at least make note of the fact that Mako is the only duelist to this point in the story that Joey canonically plays against, aside from Kaiba and Yugi, who doesn't attempt to cheat him. The last of the early competitors in Duelist Kingdom is Bones, a zombie duelist with a glandular problem that results in him having a skeletal appearance. On the island, Bones and his friends Sid and Zygor meet with Bandit Keith, who promises to mentor them so that all 4 of them can reach the finals together. However, in reality, Keith is just using them to help himself reach Pegasus. Under Keith's guidance, all 3 managed to win their opening duels, with Bones collecting 4 star chips early on. Then, when Keith learns that the boy who beat Seto Kaiba is also competing, he decides that Yugi is a problem who needs to be dealt with. Despite initially looking down on Bones' skill, Keith lent him several powerful cards to boost his chances, including Call of the Haunted. Otherwise, Bones just plays a bunch of zombie monsters with high attack and no defense that he continuously boosts up with Pumpkin, the King of Ghosts. Before taking on Yugi, they plan to take out Joey first, as he seems to be the weak link. Joey tried to escape, but Zygor knocks him unconscious and drags him into a cave where Bones' monsters will get a field power bonus. Not only that, but all of Bones' zombies would also be able to regenerate whenever they were destroyed. However, Joey ultimately finds the zombies' weaknesses. While they are powerful on the offensive, they have no defense, so by using shield and sword to swap their stats, he manages to win the duel. After the loss, Keith beat Bones, Sid, and Zygor senseless for failing, stole their remaining star chips, and completely abandoned them now that they had outlived their usefulness. Bones and his friends also pop up just before the Battle City finals, living out of a cemetery where they scam duelists into handing over their locator cards to earn their way into the playoffs, which would have worked if Bakura didn't ambush them. At this point, Bones has updated his deck a little bit, adding a few cards like Premature Burial, Nightmare Steel Cage, and Skull Invitation. But his boss monster was Great Mammoth of Goldfine, which should tell you about all you need to know about how long it took Bakura to beat him, and then banish the trio to the Shadow Realm. Or just like straight up hell in the Japanese version. That said, Bones is one of the few recurring characters to be sent to the Shadow Realm that we never see again, so we don't know if they were ever released when Bakura was ultimately defeated. And the last proper participant of the Duelist Kingdom tournament that we have to cover is Keith Howard, better known as Bandit Keith, after his notoriety for cheating his opponents in duels. Despite his negative reputation, Keith was a fairly competitive player, even making it to the finals of the Intercontinental Championship where he matched up against Maximillion Pegasus. Using the Millennium Eye, Pegasus reads Keith's mind, predicted every move, and then handed instructions to a child from the audience who defeated Keith in a single turn, completely humiliating Keith in the process. After that public embarrassment, Keith spiraled and became obsessed with revenge. He even sneaks into Duelist Kingdom in hopes of beating Pegasus to take that revenge. On the island, he pretends to mentor Sid, Zygor, and Bones, even stacking Bones' deck with rare cards and personally coaching him through a duel with Joey. Bones eventually lost that match, and despite Keith essentially playing the game for him as a backseat duelist, Keith blamed Bones, beat him and his friends up, and stole all their star chips so that he could enter Pegasus' castle. He also locked Yugi and his friends inside of the cave in hopes that they wouldn't be able to make it to the finals. Once inside the castle, Keith watched Yugi and Kaiba's rematch from the walls, and he was genuinely impressed by Yugi's skill. However, he is also completely baffled when Yugi chooses to forfeit rather than let Kaiba die. Keith eventually faces Joey in the semifinals, and here's the part where we should probably mention that he doesn't have just one deck. In fact, Keith carries several decks with unique themes and playstyles to make sure that he always has an advantage against his opponents. And along that idea, he uses a machine deck against Joey as his monsters are immune to magic, so things like Time Wizard would be ineffective against him. Most notably in this deck are cards like Launcher Spider, Zoa, Metal Zoa, Slot Machine, and of course Barrel Dragon. But he also played 3 copies of 7 Completed, which he kept up his sleeve and would pull out as needed. Now, despite countering Joey's deck and cheating, Keith is still about to lose, so he demands Joey be disqualified, claiming that he doesn't have his entry card. Joey then admits that yes, Mai had to give him her card, and then immediately points out that Keith shouldn't have known his card was missing unless he was the one who stole it himself. Pegasus backs this up, and between the theft and the blatant cheating during the duel, Pegasus disqualified Keith on the spot. And Keith didn't take this well, breaks free from security and holds a gun to Pegasus' head, or points at him menacingly in the English version, threatening him for the prize money. Pegasus doesn't flinch though, and just insulted Keith before opening a trapdoor that sends him flying into the ocean. Luckily for him, this doesn't kill him. He instead is pulled out of the water by rare hunters and brought straight to Marik Ishtar, who takes control of him and begins using him as a puppet. Then, disguised as a fortune teller, Keith approaches Yugi and asks to see the Millennium Puzzle. When Yugi handed it over, he steals it and flees to a hidden dueling arena where he chained the puzzle down and told Yugi that the only way to get it back was to duel him. In the English version, Marik also orders Keith to win the puzzle outright, while in the Japanese, Keith's mission was to force a Tem out, which is not really conducive to separating Yugi from the puzzle, but whatever, I guess. Even with his face hidden, Yugi quickly figures out that he is actually dealing Bandit Keith, and once he brings this to light, Marik reveals himself, explaining that the rare hunters had rescued Keith and given him new cards. Ironically, kind of similar to how Keith did this for Bones in the past. Beyond just Marik's influence, Keith was once again cheating by hiding cards up his sleeves, which put him ahead in the duel. This is when Bakura steps in, as he wanted the puzzle for himself and didn't want Yugi to lose it to someone else. so he frees Keith using the Millennium Ring to disrupt Marik's control. As Marik and Bakura fight over him, Keith smashes the puzzle. However, in the dub, this is done on Marik's command, while in the Japanese version, Keith does it himself, believing that the voice controlling him is from the puzzle's spirit. Bakura then knocks Keith off the platform and left Yugi to reassemble the puzzle. Meanwhile, Keith begins hallucinating Marik's voice, and in a panic, he grabs a metal pipe and lashes out, smashing the arena's power unit and starting a fire. As the building begins to burn, Joey and Tristan break in to help Yugi, as Keith sprints past them, screaming that the place is haunted, before disappearing for the remainder of the series. With that, we can go back to the Kaibas, this time focusing on Mokuba. Most of Mokuba's story has been covered in the Kaiba section, so we'll be a little bit faster here. They were orphaned at a very young age and brought to an orphanage when their remaining family stole their inheritance, but Mokuba had a very different experience than his brother did. While Seto was a genius that everyone wanted to adopt, Mokuba was like a pretty normal kid who was often overlooked. Not only that, but Seto forced himself to grow up quickly, which allowed Mokuba to remain more innocent and childlike. Mokuba was also bullied at the orphanage, but Seto always stood up for him and protected him while promising a better future one day. Eventually, Seto gets them adopted by Goaburo Kaiba when Mokuba was about 5 years old, and again, while Seto garnered most of their father's attention, Mokuba gets largely ignored. This is until the 2% of the company that Mokuba owns becomes the deciding factor in who gains control of Kaiba Corp, and of course, he sides with his brother. When Pegasus sends goons after Seto, they end up kidnapping Mokuba as he has a card that opens the secret documents needed to take over the company. However, Mokuba manages to escape from the prison by making a rope out of his bedsheets. He then manages to steal another kid's deck and star chips, and is soon confronted by Yugi, who challenges him in a duel to return them. The only cards that we see him use here are Crocodilus and Man-Eating Plant before Mokuba is found out and the game is ended. Unfortunately, technically making him a duelist that we have to cover. He is soon recaptured and brought back to Pegasus's prison, and his soul is stolen to force Seto into challenging Yugi. And while his brother couldn't end up saving him, Yugi eventually beats Pegasus and frees both Kaibas. During Battle City, Mokuba acts as a tournament commissioner, enforcing rules and calling out violations while Seto focuses on dueling. He caught the Roba brothers cheating, but ultimately allows Espa to continue the duel when he learns that he is protecting his siblings, though he does bar them from interfering any further. Mokuba is once again kidnapped, this time by the Rare Hunters, who use him as leverage to force Kaiba into a tag duel. Even while imprisoned, Mokuba helps Téa escape and later convinces Seto to save her when her life is put at risk during Joey's duel. We do gotta talk about the virtual world arc a little bit in this case, as it is important to the Kaibas. Noah begins tormenting Seto and Mokuba by forcing them to relive their past. Things escalated when Nesbit, disguised as Tristan, kidnaps Mokuba and hands him over to Noah, while Kaiba is being forced to duel against Lecter. After Kaiba wins, Noah retaliates by brainwashing Mokuba. This comes to a head during Kaiba's duel with Noah. Just as Kaiba is about to win, Noah places Mokuba in the line of attack, forcing Kaiba to choose between winning and hurting his brother. Kaiba hesitates, giving Noah an opportunity to turn the tables. However, with Yugi's help, Kaiba finally breaks through to Mokuba by opening up emotionally and reminding him of their past. That memory snaps Mokuba out of Noah's control, but it is too late, and ultimately Noah manages to beat Kaiba and turn both brothers to stone. After Noah is defeated by Yugi, everyone is restored, and the brothers are reunited, only for Goaburo to appear. Noah briefly turns against his father, helping the group escape, but then attempts to use Mokuba's body to get himself out of the virtual world. But at the last moment, Noah has a change of heart, returned to stop Goaburo, and thanked Mokuba for treating him like a real brother before sacrificing himself. Then, when it came time for the final duel of Battle City, Kaiba initially refused to watch, but Mokuba is the one that convinces him to stay and ultimately lend a card to Yugi that helps him beat Marik. Following Mokuba, we have yet another Kaiba, sort of, that being Ghost Kaiba, or the Mimic of Doom, or the Imitator of Death, whatever we want to call him, he is next. Depending on the version, Ghost Kaiba is either a master of disguise or the evil part of Kaiba that was banished by Yugi, which had been brought back to the world by Pegasus to be an Eliminator. When Mokuba escapes Pegasus' prison, Ghost Kaiba is sent to capture him and ultimately faces off with Yugi while using the real Kaiba's deck. This meant that he has all three Blue Eyes at his disposal, which would likely be an issue for Yugi to overcome now that he doesn't have Exodia. However, the real Kaiba finds that this duel is happening, hacks into Duelist Kingdom's computer network, and weakens the Ghost's Blue Eyes, allowing Yugi to win, at which point he either banishes the ghost back to the Shadow Realm or uses the Millennium Puzzle to erase him from existence. Following that, our next eliminator is Panic, who, like Ghost Kaiba, was hired by Pegasus to clear out contestants in Duelist Kingdom. That said, Panic seems to be a bit more accomplished based on the number of star chips he collected. He primarily dueled by using fear and underhanded tactics to push his opponents into uncomfortable and difficult situations that he could take advantage of. For example, by forcing Mai to wager all 8 of her star chips, rather than just the 2 that she needed to complete her set. Once the duel actually began, this would continue as he would blast flamethrowers towards his opponents and surround them with fire to scare them. Unlike Ghost Kaiba, Panic has his own unique deck though, and it's entirely made up of Dark and Fiend monsters that would be hidden in darkness by the effects of the Castle of Dark Illusions, in a very similar way to how Mako hid his monsters under the water. His deck is also a bit weird in that outside of the castle, he is exclusively using level 5 monsters, and every monster in his deck has strange attack and defense values, ending in 10, 30, 40, 60, or 80, rather than having a clean 50 or 100 like every other card in the game. In the end though, Yugi doesn't allow himself to be bullied, and Panic begins to, well, panic as a result. Once he's defeated, Panic is hit by Yugi's Mind Crush, and he is taken out just as Ghost Kaiba was. The final eliminators in Duelist Kingdom are the Paradox brothers, Para and Dox. They dueled as a tag team using Labyrinth Wall to transform the battlefield into a massive maze and turn the duel into what was effectively a board game. Their entire deck was also built around this Labyrinth game plan. Wall Shadow was a monster that could attack any monster in the Labyrinth regardless of location. Monster Tamer let them move their partner's monsters on their own turn. Dungeon Worm could be hidden underground in the maze, Jurai Gumo acted as a trap that would kill any monster that stepped on it, and of course, their boss monster was Gate Guardian. This involved 3 monsters, being Suijin, Songa, and Kazejin, which were each able to lower an opponent's monster's attack to 0 when they attacked into the Guardians. But they could also be combined into Gate Guardian, a monster with 3,750 attack, large enough to even put something like Blue Eyes to shame. On top of that, Gate Guardian could attack 3 times per turn, negate attacks from weaker monsters, and split into 2 smaller pieces if it was destroyed. Even after being defeated, the brothers tried to fool Yugi and Joey by presenting them with 2 possible exits, one which would lead them to freedom, while the other led them to an endless maze. However, Yugi sees through this trick and exposes that they could change the solution at will, which results in the protagonist passing through freely. These are the only eliminators that Yugi defeats who don't get mind crushed, though they still appear as lost souls in the Waking the Dragon arc. However, despite that, they make a reappearance in Yu-Gi-Oh! GX, where Crowler hires them to duel against Jaden and Cyrus. This time, their deck is more of a standard one that doesn't really rely on the Labyrinth game plan, though they still do use Gate Guardian, as well as the Dark Guardian, which is even bigger and can't be destroyed by battle. And our last duelist from Duelist Kingdom is going to be Bakura, and like Yugi, we will need to talk about both the modern and ancient incarnations. As we've talked about, 3 or 5,000 years ago, a young Bakura lived in the village of Kol Elna when Akhenaten massacred 99 people, leaving Bakura as the sole survivor, who was forced to watch as his friends and family were melted down into the Millennium Items. His anger fuses with the vengeful spirits of Kol Elna, and Bakura creates a monster called Diabound, and vows to take revenge on the royal family. He takes on both the Thames Slifer and Obelisk, but ultimately the Pharaoh seals himself and Zork's soul into the Millennium Pendant, so Bakura chooses to fuse his own soul with a remaining part of Zork's, creating Yami Bakura and sealing themselves inside the Millennium Ring, so that when the Millennium Items eventually resurfaced in the future, Zork could be made whole again, and then Bakura could finally take his revenge on the Pharaoh. With that, we can jump forward to the modern era, and things, again, differ depending on the version of the anime that you are watching. In the main series, Bakura's father purchases the Millennium Ring and gives it to him, turning his son into a host for the evil spirit within the ring. And just for clarity from this point on, we're going to be calling the normal Bakura, Bakura, while we call the evil Bakura, Yami Bakura, because unlike Atem and Yugi, these two share the exact same name, which makes it much more confusing. Regardless, in the Dark Side of Dimensions, this backstory changes a little bit, as Bakura's father is obsessed over finding the Millennium Ring and brings his son to Egypt where they find Shadi. Shadi allows Bakura's father to take the ring, but as he does, the spirit within emerges and kills him on the spot. However, when Bakura touches the ring, he survives and becomes the ring's new host. Regardless, the spirit of the ring begins guiding Bakura towards the other Millennium Items, and that leads him to going to school with Yugi and eventually to following him to Duelist Kingdom. He catches up with the gang and they all discuss their favorite cards, and that night he asks Yugi to duel, while then transforming into Yami Bakura and creating a shadow game once their match begins. Yami Bakura makes it so that each of Yugi's friends inhabits cards within his deck, and if any of them are in the graveyard when the duel ends, then they will be banished to the Shadow Realm. Ultimately, Yugi uses the puzzle to swap the evil and good Bakuras and send the evil one to the graveyard, and that ends the duel. Bakura's deck at this point is largely built around disrupting his opponent. He uses a bunch of weak flip monsters that have devastating effects, things like Man-Eater Bug, Mask of Darkness, and Morphing Jar, each of which are similar to how Yami Bakura is laying in wait within the normal Bakura who keeps him hidden beneath the surface. On top of that, he has cards like Chain Energy and Just Desserts to burn his opponents, while White Magical Hat makes his opponent discard cards, and of course, Change of Heart is used to take control of enemy monsters, and again, this card is fitting into the theme of Bakura and Yami Bakura each sharing the same body. After this duel, Bakura stays with the group until the night of the Duelist Kingdom finals, when he, Tristan, and Téa decide to explore Pegasus's castle. Unfortunately, Pegasus catches them and drags them into a shadow game, and this is where Yami Bakura returns, taking control of Bakura's body and ending the game himself. Later, as Yugi duels with Pegasus, Bakura overhears Tristan suggesting that they should locate the bodies of the souls that Pegasus has stolen. Yami Bakura immediately latches onto this idea and takes over again, and while sneaking through the castle, he saves Tristan from Pegasus's guards by using the Millennium Ring to bring his cards to life so that he can torture and kill any guards that they come across. Tristan pushes back against this, and Yami Bakura reveals his real plan, which differs depending on the version. In the original, he wants Mokuba's key so that he can take over Kaiba Corp, just as Pegasus was trying to do. While in the dub, he planned to use Mokuba as a new host body, which I guess would be awkward now that his name wouldn't match. Regardless, Tristan hears this and panics, grabs the ring while Bakura is distracted, and throws it deep into the jungle from the castle. He believes that this would free Bakura, but this is wrong, as the Millennium Ring is bound to Bakura and could reappear magically. After Pegasus is defeated, Yami Bakura makes his move. He challenged Pegasus to a shadow game and defeated him before ripping out the Millennium Eye from his head and stealing it for himself. With that, Bakura regroups with the others and is now in possession of 2 Millennium Items. Soon after, when the Millennium Puzzle is stolen by Bandit Keith, Bakura intervenes to ensure that the puzzle doesn't fall into Marik's hands. In the chaos, Bakura manages to place a part of his soul into the Millennium Puzzle to ensure that he could always be resurrected even if sent to the Shadow Realm. And once he knows that the puzzle is safe in Yugi's possession, he sets out to collect the remaining Millennium Items. This first leads him to the Millennium Necklace, however he is sidetracked when he discovers the Tablet of the Pharaoh's memory. After which, he tracks down the Millennium Rod and its owner, Marik Ishtar, which leads to the two of them making an alliance. Bakura would help him take down Yugi, and in return, Marik would eventually hand over the Millennium Rod. To assist with this, Bakura explains that Yugi's biggest vulnerability is his friends, and even helps Marik exploit that weakness right away. As part of the setup, Bakura would stab himself, allowing Marik, disguised as Namu, to play the hero and earn Joey and Téa's trust. While Bakura is recovering in the hospital, Yami Bakura confronts Marik again, this time in the Mindscape, only to be told that the rod would only be given to him after Battle City. But Bakura isn't one to just sit around, so when Solomon tells him that Yugi and Joey qualified for the finals, he knocks out the old man with his ring and leaves the hospital. To enter Battle City, Yami Bakura steals a duel disc, locator card, and deck, and then immediately throws the cards away because he hates them. He soon comes across Bones, Sid, and Zygor in the cemetery and challenges them to a winner-takes-all duel, without telling them that this means he is making it a shadow game. Bakura absolutely dominates this match, takes all the group's locator cards, and sends them all to the Shadow Realm, adding that he would let them out whenever he felt like it. With that, he is able to enter the playoffs, and in the quarterfinals, he faces Yugi. His deck at this point is filled with more ghostly monsters like Earl of Demise and Headless Knight, however, his entire deck starts with these cards. Firstly, he allows Yugi to tear through all of his weak fiend monsters so that he can summon Dark Necrofear, a fairly strong monster in its own right, but once it dies, it allows him to play a Dark Sanctuary automatically. This card protects Bakura while he worked on his main win condition of completing Destiny board. Once he sets all 5 pieces onto the board, it would automatically win, kinda similar to the Exodia strategy that Yugi used in the beginning of the series. On top of that, he had a bunch of defensive spells like the Dark Door, Ectoplasmer, and Multiple Destruction to slow the game down. Even so, Yugi manages to get Slifer out and is about to win, so Yami Bakura uses the kind version of himself as a shield, hoping that Yugi would refuse to hurt his friend. However, Marik intervenes, saying that the fate of the world is more important than Bakura's safety, which makes Yami Bakura panic. He reclaims control and dares Yugi to end things, to which he does, leaving Bakura in a coma. In the process, the Millennium Ring is lost and picked up by Téa, who was still under Marik's influence. And true to their alliance, Marik returns the ring, but when Bakura wakes up, he is tired of waiting for Marik's Millennium Item, and so he challenges him to a shadow game. Not only that, but he convinces the good Marik to help him in this battle, promising to take the Millennium Rod from him so that he could be free. Even with this though, Bakura is defeated and cast into the Shadow Realm, though he does promise to return, which he can do as he planted a fragment of his soul inside the Millennium Puzzle. That said, once Yami Marik is defeated, Bakura is released all the same. However, the ring is not directly connected to Bakura at this point, so his spirit is temporarily without a host. Even so, he has a lingering connection to the good Bakura, and the spirit of the ring begins haunting him, which scares Bakura so badly that he hides in a church. Despite this, Yami Bakura corners him anyways and explains that all the Millennium Items were now held by only 3 people, and the final piece, the 8th key, was a secret buried inside the Pharaoh's forbidden memories. Like the one game, but also entirely unrelated to it. The Spirit of the Ring then takes control of Bakura once again, and Yami Bakura begins working towards the ultimate shadow game. Soon Bakura reclaims the Millennium Ring, while Rex and Weevil were trying to steal the Egyptian god cards, and accidentally made off with several Millennium Items as well. Bakura temporarily sends them to the Shadow Realm in the dub, and waits for Yugi to catch up to him. When he does, Yami Bakura returns the Millennium Items as well as the god cards, though naturally he keeps the Millennium Ring for himself. He then tells Yugi that he would return it once all 7 Millennium Items were gathered and brought back to the Millennium Stone in Kul Elna. Before leaving, Yami Bakura challenges Atem to settle things in the Ultimate Shadow Game RPG. Atem accepts, and Bakura disappears, warning that it would begin once the doors to the memory world were opened. Before that could happen though, Yami Bakura makes his next move, this time targeting Kaiba. He kidnaps Mokuba because it's been 10 minutes since that has happened, and forces Kaiba to duel. All the while, Bakura mocks Kaiba relentlessly and tears into his refusal to accept the past. This duel's deck largely revolves around a monster called Dia-Bound Colonel, which would drain the attack of other monsters to allow him to overpower them, and seeing it in action, Bakura is confident that he can overpower the gods with it. However, soon the sun rises and Bakura leaves the match before it could be finished. Before he leaves though, Bakura tosses Kaiba the Millennium Eye that he had stolen from Pegasus, giving Kaiba access to the memory world. Speaking of, soon Bakura enters the memory world through the Tablet of Lost Memories alongside Atem. There, he is reunited with the fragment of himself that he had sealed in the Millennium Puzzle, and is finally whole again. From that point on, the Dark RPG began, and both Atem and Bakura would control and manipulate events through an avatar in the game. Atem controls the Pharaoh, while Bakura's influence reached to the Bandit King Bakura, Akhenaten, and Zork Necrophades. At the game table, Bakura also had 3 Hourglass tokens, one to rewind time after Yugi's friends disrupt history, another to freeze time long enough for all 7 Millennium Items to be assembled, and the final one to resurrect Zork. As the Dark RPG began to bleed into the real world, the memory world fully opened, and both he and Atem merged with their ancient selves. Meanwhile, another fragment of Bakura slips into Tristan and used him as a spy once Yugi's friends enter the Millennium World. To keep the Pharaoh's true name from being discovered, the fragment eventually reveals himself and challenges Yugi in the Shadow Game. And this is the final duel that Bakura takes part in the series. And in it, he locks Yugi down by making use of Necro Monsters, which spam the field with tokens and force Yugi to mill through his deck. This was supported by spells and traps like Counterbalance and Narrow Passage, which ultimately bring Yugi down to a single card remaining. Unfortunately, this card is Gandora, the Dragon of Destruction, which nukes Bakura's board and allowed Yugi's Silent Swordman to end the duel. As for the main body, Zork would also be defeated soon after when Atem fuses the Egyptian gods into Halakti, which both ended the conflict and cleansed the Millennium Ring of the evil spirit. With that, we have covered every duelist introduced in the Duelist Kingdom arc, and can move on to the 3 that we meet prior to Battle City beginning. First, we have Arthur and Rebecca Hawkins. Arthur had been friends with Solomon Moto and pulled him out of retirement for one final trip to Egypt, where they learned that duel monsters actually stem back to ancient Egypt's Shadow Game. Unfortunately, the site caves in and they are trapped inside. When they reach the last of their water supply, they duel to see who will be able to drink it, and Solomon surrenders before winning so that his friend has a better chance of surviving. As a thank you, Arthur gives him his prized Blue Eyes White Dragon card when they are rescued. Arthur's granddaughter, Rebecca, is the American Duel Monsters champion and is told by Bandit Keith that Solomon stole the card from her father, though. So she sets out to challenge Solomon, though she ends up dueling Yugi instead, and their duel is a 1-to-1 recreation of Arthur and Solomon's duel from the past, as both of them are using their grandfather's decks. Speaking of which, the Hawkins' deck largely revolves around filling their graveyard. With 3 copies of both Sangan and Witch of the Black Forest, they could create a steady supply of monsters that replace themselves when killed. Cannon Soldier allowed them to sacrifice their cards to deal direct damage, and Tribute to the Doom would even allow them to discard a card to destroy an enemy's monster. All of that came to a head with Shadow Ghoul, which gained 100 attack for each monster in the grave. Unfortunately for her, Yugi had Soul Release, which would have weakened Shadow Ghoul enough for him to beat her. However, he chooses to surrender just as his grandfather did so that Rebecca could learn that there is more to the game than winning. Both of these characters return in Waking the Dragons as well. Arthur is researching Atlantis and the Orichalcos, which allows him to help the protagonist plan against Darts, but this leads to him being kidnapped and his lab being burned down by Darts' lackeys. Meanwhile, Rebecca tries to join Yugi and the gang, but her grandfather won't let her. She does begin pretending that Yugi is her boyfriend though, which upsets Téa. Her deck at this point revolves around Luster Dragons, though we don't get to see too much of it. But she does return in the Grand Championship, where we do see a bit more. The Gem Dragons are still here, as well as some that haven't been printed in real Yu-Gi-Oh cards, like Ruby Dragon and Diamond Head Dragon. But now there's also a bit of a female monster theme as well, with things like Witch of the Black Forest, Fire Princess, Cure Mermaid, Injection Fairy Lily, and Marie the Fallen One. And similar to the original deck's Cannon Soldiers, Rebecca is also playing a bit more direct damage cards as well. Using this deck, she manages to beat Vivian Wong and Abe the Monkey Man, but loses to Leon von Schroeder. We also meet Duke Devlin prior to Battle City. He is the creator of Dungeon Dice Monsters, a strategy game that he personally demoed for Maximillion Pegasus shortly before Duelist Kingdom. Pegasus actually loved the game and immediately saw potential in it, to the point that he went on to greenlight the project on the spot. However, after Duelist Kingdom, Yami Bakura puts Pegasus in a coma, and that puts a halt on Duke's project. However, he doesn't know that Bakura was involved, so instead he blames Yugi, and is convinced that Yugi must have cheated to beat Pegasus and didn't deserve the title of King of Games. Not long after, Duke opens the Black Crown, a rival Shop 2 Kame game, and transfers to Domino High, where he becomes popular by doing dice tricks. This makes Joey incredibly jealous, and he challenges Duke to a duel, and Duke actually agrees, even putting up some high stakes on the match. If Joey won, Duke would close down his store, and if Duke wins, Joey would have to work for him for an entire week. However, rather than playing with pre-built constructed decks, they drafted from booster packs. And Duke manages to win by combining cards like Gradius, Limiter Removal, and Fairy Meteor Crush. After which, he forces Joey to dress up like a dog and act like a mascot for his store. Atem sees this and challenges Duke, and again, Duke puts some stakes on the match. Yugi could either win Joey's freedom, or Duke would win and Yugi would have to give up on dueling. That said, Duke would only agree to this match if they played Dungeon Dice Monsters rather than an actual duel. Despite the handicap of never playing the game before, Yugi still beats its creator, and Duke is forced to reevaluate his assumptions, realizing that Yugi probably didn't cheat against Pegasus and likely genuinely earned his victory. So he goes on to apologize and then explains that he is worried that the televised match has damaged his reputation, but Yugi and the others encourage him, pointing out the potential of Dungeon Dice Monsters as its own game. Shortly afterwards, Industrial Illusions reaches out to Duke, offering help in producing the game and releasing it worldwide as they had previously promised. During the Virtual World arc, Duke duels Nesbit of the Big Five alongside Tristan and Serenity, with the winner earning control of their body, as well as the chance to return to the real world. His deck at this time largely focuses on Dungeon Dice Monsters, and dice-related effects as well. Cards that had been dice characters in Duke's game, like Strike Ninja or Orgoth the Relentless, make up more of his useful monsters, while Dungeon Dice and Dimension Dice fill out his spells and traps, though we don't see much more than that in this game. Then, during the Waking the Dragons arc, Duke reunites with the group after helping Rex and Weevil, who had gotten themselves lost in America. Once he's back, he assists Joey, Yugi, and Kaiba against the Doma Organization, and later teams up with Rebecca Hawkins to duel Valen. Duke mostly plays support in this match, boosting Rebecca's dragon monsters, but they're ultimately beaten by Valen's armor cards. Luckily, Valen never uses the Seal of Orichalcos, so neither of them lose their souls. And after that, Duke mostly fades into just being a background character at best, while Yugi and Kaiba deal with darts. Moving into the actual Battle City arc, and we have the strongest duelist out there, Johnny Steps. Johnny was an aspiring dancer who gave up on going pro after bombing an audition and instead focused on the dance battle arcade game. He first challenges Téa to a dance battle, turning it into this weird bet where if she lost, she would have to hang out with him. Téa accepts anyways and still wins, despite Johnny deliberately tripping her and trying to elbow her mid-match. After losing, Johnny follows her and Yugi, demanding a rematch and tries to raise the stakes by saying Téa would have to be his girlfriend if he won, which is when Yugi steps in and duels him. Fitting to the whole dance theme, Johnny's deck largely revolves around musical cards like Dancing Elf, Heavy Metal King, and Spirit of the Harp, with his boss monster being Musician King, which he makes by fusing Witch of the Black Forest and Lady of Faith, marking it as one of the strangest fusions in the game. After Johnny, we have our first non-living duelist. The duel computer was a machine created by Kaiba to practice against. In particular, he gives the machine his old Blue Eyes deck and tests it against his Obelisk deck. That said, the computer doesn't end up being around very long, as Obelisk ends up being so powerful that the computer explodes. And similar to the duel computer, we also have Koji Nagumo, who Kaiba tests Obelisk against in Battle City's tournament. Koji appears early on in Battle City, and after winning a duel, he isn't satisfied with the card that he gets from his opponent, and demands that his opponent also hands over his second rarest card as well. Mokuba then steps in and says that that's not allowed, to which Kobe responds by insulting him. This leads to Kaiba getting involved and making it clear that disrespecting Mokuba is the same as disrespecting Kaiba Corp and the entire tournament. Kaiba then challenges Koji to a duel and antes an entire briefcase full of rare cards, adding that Koji would even be allowed to use those cards during the duel, and casually stating that he would just take them back once he won, which he quickly does using Obelisk. We only see a few of Koji's cards, and as I said, many of them are likely Kaiba's rather than his own, but they include Hyozen Ryu, Shadow Ghoul, and White Magical Hat. Now, keeping on the theme of Battle City contestants, and we have Esparoba. Espa was first shown taking down Rex Raptor and winning his Serpent Knight Dragon, after which Rex warns Joey not to duel him as he claims that Espa is a psychic who could see every card in his opponent's hand. Since Joey already had experience playing against people who claim to be psychic, he accepts the duel anyways. At first, it really seems like he's able to see what's in Joey's hand, but then Mokuba figures out what's really happening. Espa's little brothers were spying from a nearby building and feeding information to their brother through an earpiece. When Mokuba moved to disqualify him, the brothers begged him to stop and explained that the psychic act was used to protect them. They had grown up as carnival kids and were constantly bullied, so Espa built up an image of being an unbeatable psychic to keep people from messing with them. That hit pretty close to home for Mokuba, who saw a lot of Seto in what Espa was doing, and so he let the duel continue, but only if the cheating stopped. Espa and Joey end up having a decent match after this, though without the siblings' help, he ends up losing. However, he promises to have a rematch with Joey one day in the future with no cheating or gimmicks involved. As for his deck, Espa mostly uses machine-type monsters and cards that revolve around the theme of psychic abilities, things like brain control, mesmeric control, and mind control, for example. Most importantly, though, is of course his Jinzo, a powerful monster that negates the effects of trap cards. This became even more scary when combined with Amplifier, which boosted its attack every turn. Now from there we can get into Marik's Rare Hunters. This is a group of duelists being controlled by him that scour the world to collect rare cards, specifically looking for the final god card, or at least powerful cards that could help them win Obelisk in a duel. First up we have, well, Rare Hunter, also known as Seeker in the English dub. After the merchant who sold Yugi and Joey their duel disc tips Marik off, Seeker and two other hunters jump Joey and force him into a duel. And this is probably a duelist whose deck we need to talk about ahead of time. Seeker runs a ton of defensive cards like Giant Soldier of Stone and Swords of Revealing Light, as well as draw cards like Graceful Charity, which help him get into his Exodia pieces, of which he plays 3 each. This allows him to defeat Joey pretty easily, and just for fun, he and the Rare Hunters beat Joey up and steal his red eyes as well. When the tournament officially begins, Joey tracks Seeker down again, but Seeker refuses to have a rematch, as Joey doesn't have any rare cards left that are worth wagering, and so Yugi steps in to duel him instead. Joey tries to warn him about the Exodia strategy, but Yugi brushes it off and said he'll figure it out midway through the duel. He initially locks Seeker out of holding Exodia pieces with cards like Time Seal and Light Force Sword, and then Seeker summons one of the Exodia pieces, which allows Yugi to use Chain Destruction to eliminate all other copies that Seeker had, essentially meaning that his deck no longer had a win condition, and allowing Yugi to win himself, at which point he exposes that Seeker was using fake cards. Also, shout out to that clip of Michael from Rooster Teeth dueling Seeker in Legacy of the Duelist. Easily one of my favorite videos of all time.
What?
Our next rare hunter is Arcana. Before Battle City, he was a world-famous stage magician from France. He had money, fame, and a partner that he genuinely loved called Catherine, who was also his fiancée in the dub. However, one day his life fell apart when an escape trick that he'd performed countless times went wrong. The stunt ended in an explosion that destroyed his career and permanently disfigured his face, which is why he started wearing his mask. With his reputation gone and his looks ruined, Arcana began spiraling, and started to push Catherine away out of shame, and she eventually left as a result. Now, with no career or relationship, he began drifting through life completely broken until Marik approached him and promised him everything he had lost if he became a rare hunter and killed Yugi Muto for him. As a result, he set up their duel to be a full-on death trap. He locks both of them into a custom arena, and every time they took damage, spinning buzzsaws would close in on them. Though in the dub, the loser would just be sent to the Shadow Realm. Throughout the duel, Arcana acted completely unhinged. He refused every chance to end the danger, and instead insisted that this was his great performance. He also believed himself to be the ultimate Dark Magician user, who ran multiple copies in his deck, as well as a ton of support cards for him directly, like Thousand Knives. Aside from that, he had a bunch of spellcaster support, and cards based on magic and escape tricks. Unfortunately for him, Yugi had Dark Magician Girl, which got stronger for each Dark Magician in both players' graveyard, which ultimately allows her to overpower anything Arcana had. When he loses the duel, he initially planned to escape using a spare key that was hidden up his sleeve. However, that plan goes out the window when Marik erases the key from his mind as punishment for failing. Yugi ends up saving him before the saw blades kill him, and Arcana runs backstage to reunite with Catherine, only to find a dummy instead, which completely breaks him, and that's kind of where we leave him. The third and probably most infamous rare hunter is Strings. He's a street mime who lost his mind after killing his parents, and the guilt wrecked him so badly that he shut off his own conscience. This made him a perfect puppet for Marik, who steps in, takes control, and uses him in an attempt to duel and kill Yugi. What makes Strings stand out so much is that Marik entrusts him with Slifer the Sky Dragon, meaning Yugi had to overcome his first Egyptian god card to win this duel. Slifer gains power based on the number of cards in its owner's hand, so Strings set up an ultimate defense by playing Revival Jam and Jam Defender, which would force the Jam to keep absorbing attacks, and then the Jam would resurrect itself. He would then activate Card of Safe Return, which meant that every time Revival Jam saved itself, he would draw cards, and Infinite cards, which allowed him to have an infinite hand size, and suddenly Slifer could grow to ridiculous attack points. Then there was Slifer's second ability, which lowered the attack of monsters that Yugi tried to summon by 2,000, and destroyed any that got pushed down to 0, essentially meaning Strings had a perfect defense, an ultimate attack, and a way to stop Yugi from developing a board. This completely shakes Yugi's confidence until Kaiba shows up and snaps him out of it. Yugi then comes up with a strategy where he takes the Revival Jam, Slifer's second effect kills it, and then it resurrects itself, triggering Card of Safe Return. Then the Revival Jam would get killed again, and then revived over again, and Strings would draw more cards. This repeated until Strings decked out, and Yugi wins the match as well as his first Egyptian god. And our final rare hunters are a tag team, similar to Para and Dox, this time being Loomis and Umbra. After Marik's crew grabs Joey, Mokuba, and Téa, Loomis and Umbra drag Yugi and Kaiba up to a rooftop and force them into a tag duel. Each duelist stood on a glass panel rigged with a shadow box, meaning that the moment that their life points hit 0, the floor would drop below them, and they would fall to their deaths, or be claimed by the Shadow Realm. However, unlike Para and Dox, Loomis and Umbra are pretty terrible teammates. They were competing for Marik's favor throughout much of the game, and they end up betraying each other a few times in an attempt to look superior, rather than actually working together to beat Yugi and Kaiba. And Kaiba, being who he is, naturally exploits this by taunting them even further. Umbra is the first one to reach 0 life points and would fall to his death, but a parachute saves him. Soon after, Loomis surrenders, but Marik takes over his body with the Millennium Rod and leaves him comatose after taunting Yugi and Kaiba. Now, fitting to their design, Loomis and Umbra use cards that largely revolve around masks. Loomis has things like Mask of Restrict, Weakness, Dispel, Accursed, Remnants, and Brutality, and we only see him play 2 monsters, being Grand Tiki Elder and Melkid. Meanwhile, Umbris is the more monster-focused deck, capping things off with the Mass Beast and Mass Beast Desgardius. Following the Rare Hunters, we have Marik and Ishizu Ishtar, as well as Odeon. They all grew up together and share a backstory, so we're going to be covering them all together and then splitting off from there. The Ishtars are a line of tomb keepers who serve the Pharaoh, and since his reign they have stood guard over the secrets of unlocking his memories, as well as the Millennium Rod and Necklace. The firstborn son of each generation would be entrusted to continue this tradition and live in this tomb, while the other siblings would be free to live their own lives however they pleased. Marik and Ishizu's father wanted a male heir to inherit this position, however he and his wife were having trouble conceiving. Eventually, a baby was abandoned on their doorstep and Miss Ishtar brought him in, naming him Odeon and adopting him as their son. However, her husband never really accepted the child. Even so, with no heir of his own, he agreed that if they didn't have a son by the time Odeon turned 10, he would be made the next tomb keeper officially. A few years later, the Ishtar welcomed their first child into the world, though it ended up being a daughter, much to Mr. Ishtar's disappointment. Her name was Ishizu. However, 4 years later, they had another child, and this time it would be a boy named Marik. Unfortunately, Mrs. Ishtar died in childbirth, and as a result, Odeon was reduced to being a servant who was meant to watch over Marik, rather than being a true part of the family in his father's eyes. One day, Marik was bitten by a cobra, and Mr. Ishtar brutally beat Odeon for failing to protect him, and even went on to threaten to end his life if he ever failed again. Over time, Marik grew to fear the idea of being locked in the tomb for the rest of his life, and wanted to be able to leave to see the rest of the world. However, when he turned 10 or 12 in the dub, his father carved the Pharaoh's secret onto his back, locking his fate as the tomb keeper. And yes, carved as in with a knife rather than the tattoo that we see in the dub. This was such a traumatic and horrific experience that Marik developed a split personality called Yami Marik. In a show of solidarity, Odeon carved markings onto his own face as well so that Marik wouldn't need to suffer alone, a sentiment which helped keep the dark Marik under control, and then Ishizu was praying or something, so I guess equal punishment all around. A year later, Marik and Ishizu snuck out of the tomb to visit a nearby town, and Odeon covered for them inside the tomb. But as they left, they triggered a secret alarm, and Mr. Ishtar knew right away. As a result, he either repeatedly cut Odeon with searing hot blades, or whipped him, depending on the version of the series you are watching. When Marik returns, he tries to stop his father, but he continues to beat Odeon until Marik thinks that he is dead. And with Odeon now unresponsive, there is nothing to keep Yami Marik in check, and he takes over their body. He then steals the Millennium Rod from his father, and we get 3 fairly different levels of brutality of what happens next depending on the version you are taking in. In the dub, Yami Marik sends his father to the Shadow Realm. In the Japanese anime, he stabs him to death with the Millennium Rod, and these are pretty standard. Meanwhile, in the manga, he slices the skin off of his father's back to remove the Tomb Keeper's carving, and then throws it onto Odeon, who wanted to become a Tomb Keeper himself. Odeon then wakes up, which seals Yami Marik away, and having lost his memories of the event, Marik ends up assuming that the Pharaoh's follower Shadi killed their father, and Odeon agrees to this so that Marik won't be racked with guilt. Marik already hated the Pharaoh as he blamed him for the Tomb Keeper's fate of living sealed away from the world, but now he also thought that he was responsible for killing his father. And so, Marik becomes consumed with the idea of taking revenge, which leads him to starting the Rare Hunters. So his plan is to gather all 3 god cards, become the new Pharaoh himself, and end the Tomb Keeper's tradition. Though in the dub, the plan is just to use the Pharaoh's power to take over the world. While they fairly quickly manage to get their hands on the Winged Dragon of Ra and Slifer the Sky Dragon, Ishizu's Millennium Necklace allows her to see her brother's plan, and so she takes Obelisk the Tormentor for herself before Marik can get a hold of it. Now, focusing on Ishizu for a moment, she becomes the Secretary General of the Egyptian Supreme Council of Antiquities at the Domino City Museum, specifically to draw in Yugi and Kaiba. Once Kaiba visits, she gives him Obelisk and urges him to create a tournament with an anti-system so that he can draw out the other 2 Egyptian god cards, though she does warn him that her Millennium Necklace is saying that he will eventually lose Obelisk in a duel. And this just goads him into starting the tournament to prove her wrong. Ishizu eventually qualifies for the quarterfinals herself and duels Kaiba there. Thanks to her necklace, she can predict every move that he's about to make and is completely confident in her victory. But Kaiba's ancient connection to the Millennium Rod reveals a vision of Kisara and the Blue Eyes tablet, which pushes him to abandon Obelisk entirely. And by tributing the god to summon the Blue Eyes White Dragon, Kaiba steps outside of the future that Ishizu foresaw and wins the match for himself. While Ishizu loses the duel, she does gain the proof that destiny isn't fixed, which gives her hope that Marik's future can still be changed. So, now let's talk about her deck. Ishizu mostly plays Earth Fairy monsters, whose retrained cards have now become infamous as some of the most powerful cards ever made in Yu-Gi-Oh! However, the originals are a bit lacking. These include Agido, Kelbeck, Keldo, and Mudora, though these are all even worse than the original TCG versions, as the ones in the anime don't even have abilities. Her deck has two main strategies, which paired with her ability to see the future to pretty much ensure that she should have beaten Kaiba, at least if the Millennium Rod didn't intervene. Firstly, Exchange of the Spirit could swap the cards in both players' graveyards with their decks. So, by filling her graveyard quickly and avoiding putting cards in Kaiba's, and then playing Exchange of the Spirit, she could severely limit his options while essentially giving her all of her own cards back. This also meant that she would know exactly which cards were remaining in Kaiba's deck, which allowed Muko to be insanely strong. In the anime, this card allows her to negate any card drawn or played from hand, and then send that card to the graveyard, which again is kind of nutty if you can see the future. And second, a trap called Sacrifice's Blast, which put a bomb in a monster on the field. Then, when that card is used for a tribute summon and that new monster attacks, its attack would be dealt to its owner's life points directly. So when Kaiba uses Soul Exchange to sacrifice Ishizu's monsters, this puts a bomb in his obelisk, which would have dealt 4,000 damage to him directly and could have won her the game on the spot. With that, we can go back to Odeon. He follows Marik and becomes the second in command of the Rare Hunters, not because he believes in Marik's mission, but because he knows that if he leaves Marik's side, then the evil personality will take control. When Battle City begins, Marik sends Odeon ahead to do the dirty work. He duels across the city to collect all 12 locator cards that they will need, and then takes on the role of Marik in public, while the real Marik uses the name Namu. To sell this act, Odeon is even given a fake Millennium Rod and a copy of the Winged Dragon of Ra, though he doesn't know about the card at the time. During Yugi's duel with Bakura, he pretends to use the Millennium Rod to force Bakura's spirit out and push Yugi into forfeiting. However, Yami Bakura simply takes control again, so Yugi is free to win the duel. Soon after, Odeon duels Joey, and Joey notices that something doesn't add up with this version of Marik, who actually duels with honor, treats Joey with respect, and fights like a real duelist rather than being anything like the sadistic manipulator that they had seen up to this point. Odeon eventually draws Ra and begins to panic as he knows how dangerous this card can be for anyone it doesn't deem worthy. However, Marik intervenes through the rod and orders Odeon to summon Ra anyways by framing it as proof that Odeon is finally a true Tomb Keeper. And wanting that approval more than anything, Odeon obeys. However, when he does, Ra turns on him and strikes both he and Joey with lightning. Just before losing consciousness, he reveals that Yami Marik will be freed without him in the picture, so he admits to Joey that he isn't Marik, and thanks him for the duel before collapsing and falling into a coma. For the rest of Battle City, Yami Marik repeatedly tries and fails to kill Odeon. During the final duel, the spirit of the good Marik briefly awakens Odeon, thanking him for being a loyal brother for all of the years they've known each other. Odeon then forces himself to the top floor of the tower and calls out to Marik to fight back, and that push, along with Yugi winning the Shadow Game, allows Yami Marik to finally be destroyed. Odeon's deck is pretty interesting in that he only runs 2 actual monsters that we see, with one of them being a ritual monster in the anime, Mystical Beast Circuit, and the other being an Egyptian god with the fake copy of Ra. That said, the majority of his deck revolves around summoning Circuit and getting the required cards to play it, like Temple of the Kings. Outside of that, he is pretty famous for using traps that become monsters, like Embodiment of Apophis. And finally, we have Marik. When Kaiba announces the tournament, Marik has the Rare Hunters hack into Kaiba Core security systems to enter several members of their organization into the event. After Yugi beats Seeker, Marik hijacks his body with the Millennium Rod just to formally introduce himself. Then again, after Arcana loses, Marik does the same thing, this time explaining his plan to Yugi. Marik's first serious attempt to take Yugi down comes through Strings, who he gives Slifer the Sky Dragon to. And this is very close to actually working, however, Yugi manages to pull through and win Slifer, actively pushing Marik's plans back for once. From there, Marik pivots. He forms an alliance with Yami Bakura and promises to give him the Millennium Rod if Bakura helps him take out the Pharaoh. And on Bakura's advice, they begin targeting Yugi's friends. To sell this act, Bakura stabs himself and lets the good version of him take control, and then has Marik pose as Namu to bring him to his friends and gain Joey, Téa, and Solomon's trust. This creates an opening for Marik to brainwash both Joey and Téa, and meanwhile, Yugi and Kaiba manage to take down Umbra, so Marik possesses Loomis, just to gloat about having Yugi's friends. This leads directly into the shadow game between Yugi and Joey, which Marik wants to end with the Pharaoh's death. Instead though, Yugi takes over mid-battle, and Joey eventually breaks free of Marik's control. By the quarterfinals, Marik, Bakura, and Odeon are still in the competition. Marik continues hiding as Namu, while Odeon pretends to be him. During Yugi and Bakura's match, Marik keeps trying to interfere, ordering Bakura to take control when things go south, and Odeon even fakes using the Millennium Rod to free Bakura, hoping that Yugi won't attack his injured friend. However, like I said, the good Bakura isn't in control for very long, and Yami Bakura takes over again, which allows Yugi to finish the duel with Slifer. During Odeon's quarterfinal match against Joey, Yami Marik makes a play to take full control over Marik's body. He convinces Odeon to summon a counterfeit copy of Ra, which results in Odeon being struck by lightning and made comatose, though not before he reveals the truth about Marik's identity. Once Odeon collapses and is no longer able to keep the darkness at bay, Yami Marik is able to fully seize control of their body, which is terrible timing for Mai, who Marik defeats in their match immediately afterwards and traps in the Shadow Realm. While Ishizu was dueling Kaiba in the quarterfinal match, the real Marik is trapped inside his own mind, imprisoned by his darker half, who was taking advantage of Marik's guilt, fear, and self-hatred. Through Téa's mind, Marik was forced to relive his past and comes to terms with the moment that Yami Marik was created. After the quarterfinals, Marik teams up with Yami Bakura to try and stop Yami Marik, but they fail when Yami Marik reveals abilities on Ra that even the good Marik doesn't know exists. Still, the good Marik tries to warn Ishizu through Téa to hide Odeon, knowing that his darker half would try to kill him. In the finals between Yami Marik and Yugi, the Shadow Game causes the weaker soul inside either duelist to fade away whenever they take damage. As the duel drags on, Marik's soul begins to disappear piece by piece, and as it did, he begged the Pharaoh for forgiveness and asked him to win, even if it meant that he would be lost in the Shadow Realm. Odeon eventually wakes up and helps Marik regain control, meaning that the dark side was targeted by the Shadow Game instead. This meant that when Yugi wins the duel, Yami Marik was destroyed once and for all, releasing all of those who he had trapped in the Shadow Realm. With Marik's ultimate defeat, both he and his sister give their Millennium Items to Yugi, as well as the Winged Dragon of Ra. Most importantly though, Marik also reveals the Tomb Keeper's carving on his back. With that, the Tomb Keeper's duty has been fulfilled, and the Ishtar are freed, though they do help Yugi and his friends with the ceremonial duel that follows shortly afterwards. So when it comes to decks, Marik has actually used quite a lot of them, as we've discussed by proxy through controlling others. These include Bandit Keith, Strings, and Joey. Then we have Yami Marik's deck, which makes use primarily of Dark and Fiend monsters, as well as having a heavy theme of control and burn effects, all while building up towards summoning Ra. Though notably, we know of nearly 60 cards, making him the non-protagonist character whose deck that we have seen the most of throughout the entire series. And he has plenty of iconic cards to fulfill this deck list as well, things like Boganian, Hellpoemer, Lava Golem, Makura, Nudoria, and Holding Arms and Legs, as well as the Egyptian god Slime. Meanwhile, spells and traps like Nightmare Wheel, Coffin Cellar, Vengeful Bog Spirit, and Dark Wall of Wind allow him to slow the game down enough to maintain control while ripping through his opponent's life points. Now, moving on to the virtual world filler arc, and we have a few duelists to talk about here. And interestingly, this is actually where we get the first match for Tristan, which, yes, means that he never has a canon duel throughout the entire series, despite having cards of his own. Like Téa and Joey, Tristan sneaks onto the boat to Duelist Kingdom, and it's a good thing he does, as when Weevil throws Yugi's Exodia cards into the ocean, both Yugi and Joey jump into the water to grab them, and it is up to Tristan to throw them the ladder to safety. Through most of Duelist Kingdom, Tristan is largely a supporting character, but whereas Téa is usually motivating Yugi, Tristan is more about supporting Joey. For example, he gives Joey his Lava Battle Guard, which boosts his own Swamp Battle Guard in duels, noting that these cards work together in the same way that Joey and Tristan do. This is also relevant as it shows that Tristan does have his own cards and deck, despite never dueling in these early arcs. Later, when Bakura shows up, Tristan even mentions that his favorite card is the Cyber Commander, so again, he has some connection to the game at least. That said, while he doesn't duel, he does get involved in many of the more physical things that happen in the series. For example, when he suspects Pegasus is cheating, he is the one who goes to look for evidence. He's also the one who rescues Mokuba's body as well, and even when Yami Bakura shows up and takes out Pegasus's guards, Tristan finds a non-dueling solution by throwing the Millennium Ring into the forest below the castle. After they leave the island, Yugi gets forced into a duel with Bandit Keith and the building catches on fire, at which point Joey and Tristan arrive to help rescue him, as well as his cards and the Millennium Puzzle. Later on, when Joey goes missing right before Serenity's eye surgery, Tristan rides around the city looking for him and eventually finds him on the beach, where he is spiraling over having lost the red eyes and feeling like he doesn't deserve to face his sister anymore. So Tristan does what he does best and knocks some sense into Joey before dragging him to the hospital to see Serenity. Around this time, Tristan gets a crush on Serenity and starts regularly visiting her in the hospital, as well as bragging about how he taught Joey how to duel. He ends up bringing a laptop to her room and watches Joey's matches so that he can let her know what her brother is doing and if he's winning or losing his games. Although he originally lies to her so that she won't worry, but she insists that he tells the truth. As Battle City wraps up, Tristan keeps trying to push Joey towards easier and easier wins to qualify faster, but Joey refuses. Even so, Tristan sticks with him anyways and tags along to the aquarium where he duels Mako Tsunami. After which, Joey qualifies for the finals, and Tristan immediately volunteers to go pick up Serenity. Not long after, Tristan and Serenity get jumped by rare hunters in the street, and Tristan has Serenity hop onto his back and tries to run away from them. They end up getting cornered, but they're saved at the last second by Duke Devlin. The rare hunters show up again, and while Duke takes Serenity to safety, Tristan stays behind and beats them up for information, where he learns that Joey is at Domino Pier. And so he, Duke, Serenity, and Mai head over together as quickly as they can. At the pier, Tristan arrives just in time to see a possessed Joey dueling Yugi. After it's over, Tristan pulls Yugi out of the water and later reassures Joey, reminding him of everything that he's fought through for Serenity. As we enter the playoffs for Battle City, Tristan doesn't get all that involved. Essentially, he and Duke start competing for Serenity, and Tristan leads a search for the Millennium Ring after it vanishes from Bakura when he is defeated. At which point, he and Duke end up dangling over the edge of the blimp and need to be saved by Shadi. Outside of that though, Tristan spends the rest of Battle City and the rest of the series on the sideline. The Bakura does hijack his body for a short period during the Dark RPG. However, he does play some kind of role in the virtual world and the Waking the Dragons arc. When the gang gets sent to the virtual world, they're split up almost immediately, and Tristan, Duke, and Serenity end up together. Tristan tries to protect Serenity and jumps into a duel against Nesbit and loses, which results in his body being stolen and leaves his mind stuck in a robotic monkey for the rest of the arc. While Tristan is stuck like that, he bounces around and helps where he can. He watches Yugi and Joey duel the Big Five to win back his body, and slowly starts to worry that he's never going to get it back at all. Meanwhile, Kaiba loses to Noah, Yugi steps in, and Noah starts turning Yugi's friends into stone mid-duel. Luckily, Yugi pulls through, beats Noah, and everyone gets restored. Now, his duel against Nesbit alongside Duke and Serenity is the only duel that Tristan gets in the series, and in it, he has a kind of robot soldier themed deck, making use of Cyber Commander, Launcher Spider, Command Angel, and Super Robo Yaru. Aside from that, he gets two duels where he isn't in control of his own body. One where the Big Five take turns inside of him. I probably could have worded that better, but as a result of having so many people there, they play with an extremely varied deck that fits each of their strategies. And like I mentioned, Yami Bakura takes control of him during the Dawn of the Duel arc, and has a Necro and Mill deck that we talked about in the Bakura section. Like Tristan, Serenity also duels against Nesbit, so we can cover her here as well. When she was 7 years old, her parents divorced and she was separated from her brother. She went to live with her mom while Joey stayed behind with their dad, and from that point on, Joey basically made it his mission to look out for her even if they weren't together anymore. Which reaches a peak just before Duelist Kingdom when Joey gets a videotape from Serenity that explains that she's going to go blind unless she can get an incredibly expensive eye operation. The only way for Joey to afford this is by winning the $3 million prize at the Duelist Kingdom tournament, but he unfortunately is only runner-up. However, luckily, the winner is Yugi, who hands him the prize money right away, and so Joey can pay for his sister's surgery. By the time that Battle City starts, the operation has been a success, but Serenity is still stuck in the hospital recovering, with Tristan basically acting as her full-time babysitter. She eventually sneaks out to follow the gang to Domino Pier, where Yugi and a Marik-controlled Joey are stuck in a brutal shadow game. With the help of Duke and Mai, she gets past the rare hunters, and when she finally removes her bandages, the first thing that she ever clearly sees is Joey risking his life to save Yugi. She jumps into the water with no hesitation, frees her brother, and helps save them both. With that, we can jump ahead to the virtual world, and she duels alongside Duke and Tristan against Nesbit. Considering she had only just begun learning about what Duel Monsters was just a few days prior, she is definitely the weak link in the match. And as a result, Tristan ends up taking a loss and has his body stolen to protect her, which shakes up Serenity pretty badly, but once she gets back on her feet, she mostly sticks around the monkey Tristan for the rest of the arc. Serenity's deck here is, as we've seen, quite a lot for the female duelists in the series, largely based on women, many of whom we've actually seen in other decks to this point. Fire Princess, Saint Joan, the Forgiving Maiden, and Wingweaver, for example. She also runs Bad Reaction to Samochi, which is a classic gimmick card that turns healing into direct damage, and Lady Panther to mirror her brother's Panther Warrior. Okay, our next duelist is actually 5 duelists, but they are effectively used as one character, so we're going to cover them all at once. This is the Big 5, which includes Gansley, Crump, Johnson, Nesbit, and Lecter. At some point, they were brought in by Goaburo Kaiba to work at Kaiba Corp back when it was still a military's weapon company. However, Seto eventually convinced them that Goaburo was holding them back and promised them real power if they backed him instead. They bought 49% of the company, combined it with the 2 that Seto already had, and Goaburo was voted out while Seto Kaiba became president, only for Seto to immediately pull the rug out from under them. He broke the deal, stripped them of any real authority, shut down the weapons division entirely, and pivoted Kaiba Corp into a gaming company rather than a military weaponry one. And naturally, the Big 5 wasn't super happy with this. And so they tried to work out a deal with Maximillion Pegasus. The plan was to kill Kaiba, but when they failed, they would instead try to kidnap Mokuba and use him as leverage to take over the company. But then Yugi gets involved, beats Pegasus, and Bakura puts Pegasus into a coma, which is basically the end of the Big 5's plans. Actually, in the manga, this is more or less where their story ends in general. They get fired and vanish, but in the anime though, after Seto learns about their betrayal, they offer him a peace gesture by means of a test run of Kaiba Corp's full immersion virtual reality system, with the actual plan to be trapping Seto inside the game forever while they can start to take over the company. Unfortunately, Yugi once again gets involved, and by the end of it, the Big 5 get trapped inside virtual reality themselves instead. After being trapped inside Kaiba Corp's system, the Big 5 wander the company's computer networks until they are discovered by Noah Kaiba, Gozaburo's biological son. Noah also wants control of Kaiba Corp, and so the two sides form an alliance. Noah lures Seto, Yugi, and their friends to an underground base and forces them into a version of the virtual world, and once inside, the Big 5 revealed that they no longer have physical bodies, and that they have made a deal with Noah that if they defeat any duelist here, they can take their bodies and then return to the real world. Each member duels using an avatar based on their deck master, but one by one they lose, consistently underestimating their opponents and relying too heavily on rigid, calculated strategies. The exception is Nesbit, who in a 3-on-1 duel against Tristan, Duke, and Serenity manages to pull ahead and Tristan has to sacrifice himself to protect Serenity. Although Nesbit still loses the match overall, he breaks the agreement and takes Tristan's body anyways, and using it, he then kidnaps Mokuba and hands him over to Noah while the rest of the Big Five attempt to steal more bodies by force. So, let's talk about each of the members and the decks that they use more directly. Gansley was the Vice President of Business Strategies for Kaiba Corp and used a Deep Sea Warrior as his deck master, which basically let him use Magic Cylinder at any time by sacrificing 2 monsters. To enable this, his entire deck revolved around summoning as many monsters as possible, as quickly as possible, and even reviving them with cards like Premature Burial. Second is Adrian Randolph Crump III, who was Kaiba Corp's chief financial officer, and he really likes penguins. So much so that he wanted to make a penguin-themed amusement park, and as you might have imagined, his deck revolved around penguins as well. Johnson was Kaiba Corp's lawyer and has the absolutely insane deck master of Judgeman. This card lets him use Regeki at any point by paying 1,000 life points, and then it would deal 500 points of damage to his opponent for every monster destroyed with this effect. And to help pay for this, Johnson's deck is all about gaining life, which effectively is an infinite resource loop here. The chief technical officer for Kaiba Corp was Nesbit, and fitting to being an engineer, his deck master was Robotic Knight. This let him deal 500 direct damage by discarding a machine monster, and as such, his deck is full of cards like Cannon Soldier, Machine King, and Perfect Machine King. And he added in cards like Clockwork Knight that turned all opponents' monsters into machines while making them lose 500 attack, and then boosted all of his own machines by 500 attack as well. And the last member of the Big Five was Gozaburo's personal assistant Lecter. He used Jinzo as his deck master, which only negated opponents' traps, as well as Imperial Order to negate their spells, locking them out of most cards in the game. Ultimately, Noah was so angered by their losses and by their disobedience that he gave them one final opportunity, forcing them to share Tristan's body and duel Yugi and Joey together. Despite rotating control and combining their deck masters into a single monster, that being the 5-headed dragon, or at least its ritual counterpart, the mythic dragon in the anime, the Big Five lose again here. And after another failed attempt to seize bodies, Noah refuses to trust them again. In the Japanese version, he deletes the Big Five outright, while in the dub they are imprisoned within isolated sections of the virtual world, and ultimately get erased in the end anyways when the system is destroyed. Now, speaking of Noah Kaiba, his father Gozaburo intended to mold him into the future head of Kaiba Corp. Like Seto later on, Noah was pushed through intense training in just about every subject imaginable, but unlike Seto, Noah actually enjoyed it. Gozaburo spared no expense in hiring the best tutors available and shaping Noah into what he thought the perfect heir should be. That all ended though when Noah was 12 years old. After a serious car accident left him on the brink of death, Gozaburo chose to upload Noah's mind into a supercomputer, preserving his consciousness while his body was lost. Noah woke up inside a virtual world that initially consisted of nothing but a recreation of his bedroom, though it was gradually expanded into a much larger digital environment. At first, Noah didn't hate it. The virtual world was safe, controlled, and built entirely around him. But over time, the cracks started to show. The artificial people were behaving wrong, his virtual pet glitched, and nothing ever really felt right. And with no actual human contact, Noah's intelligence and ego continued to grow, but emotionally he stayed frozen as a child. He became bitter, impatient, and increasingly cruel as a result. Meanwhile, Gozaburo adopted Seto, and at first he was meant to be a new host body for Noah. However, Gozaburo began seeing Seto as a more ideal version of what Noah was supposed to become. Eventually, he stopped caring about Noah entirely and decided that his real son was a lost cause, and so all of his attention was dedicated to Seto instead. Seto later seized control of Kaiba Corp and left Gozaburo with nothing, and so Gozaburo followed the same path as Noah and uploaded his own consciousness into the virtual world as a result. 6 years after being abandoned in that virtual world, Noah hijacks Seto's blimp mid-flight and traps Seto and everyone on board, forcing most of them to take part in his virtual world. Noah's goal was to steal a body, ideally Seto's, and reclaim his place as the rightful heir to Kaiba Corp. But to do that, he teamed up with the Big Five and his father. Despite facing non-duelists a lot of the time and inexperienced players like Téa, Tristan, Duke, and Serenity, the Big Five still managed to lose almost every match. The only body they claimed was Tristan's, and even that happened on a technicality, since Serenity ultimately won the duel with Duke's help. After the Big Five were completely shut down in a final match by Yugi and Joey, Noah lost patience. He erased them entirely, or imprisoned them in the virtual world depending on the version, and decided to handle things himself. Noah then brainwashed Mokuba into believing that Noah was his real brother, and used Mokuba as leverage to weaken Seto emotionally before dueling him directly. During their duel, he even used Mokuba as a shield, knowing that Seto would never risk his brother getting hurt to win a duel. Despite this, Seto managed to break through the mind control and free his brother, at which point Noah just turns both brothers to stone anyways. And with Kaiba out of the picture, it is up to Yugi to step in and finish the match using a combined deck of his own cards and Kaiba's. Noah then turns Yugi's remaining friends into stone as well, and steadily restores his own life points through Shinado and his spirit monsters, while Yugi started the duel with just about nothing left. Things seem pretty hopeless until Yugi uses Card of Sanctity, which refills his hand and gives him access to Kaiba's 3 blue eyes. Yugi then fuses them together into the Blue Eyes Ultimate Dragon, takes out Noah's field, and then uses D-Fusion to finish the match. Afterwards, Noah pretends to help the protagonist escape Goaburo, and originally wanted to steal Mokuba's body on the way out. However, in the end, he lets them all escape and thanks Mokuba for treating him like a real brother. Now, let's talk Noah's deck. This is an interesting one as it tells a story before it actually reaches its own strategy. He begins with cards related to Greco-Roman myth, things like Ares and Chiron the Mage, then wipes things out with a biblical giant flood. From there, he explored the Age of the Dinosaurs with Giant Rex and the Last Tusk Mammoth, the Ice Age with Ice Age Panic, and even into the future with Gradius, all leading towards the Apocalypse and his deck master Shinado, King of a Higher Plane. This all builds towards Noah's ultimate strategy of giving himself sky-high life points while he tries to overwhelm his opponents little by little. As for his father, we've touched on Goaburo quite a bit throughout this video, so I'll be as brief as I can. Goaburo Kaiba was the original founder and CEO of Kaiba Corp back when it was still a massive military weapons company. He built his power by funding wars, supplying weapons, and treating global conflicts like a business opportunity. Because Darts later impersonated him, Goaburo also gained a reputation as someone who profited from both sides of war, reinforcing his image as a cold, power-hungry tyrant. He originally intended for Noah to inherit Kaiba Corp until he was in a terrible car accident, at which point Goaburo placed his mind into the virtual world to keep some part of him alive. Soon after, he was challenged into a game of chess by an orphan named Seto, with a wager being placed over whether or not Goaburo would have to adopt Seto and Mokuba. Goaburo ends up losing and was made to take the children in, but this actually worked in his favor as he believed Seto would be a good new host body for his real son. However, Seto proved to actually be a better potential heir, so Noah was disregarded pretty much entirely. Goaburo constantly threatened to send Kaiba back to an orphanage, stripped him of anything resembling joy, and told him that the Kaiba family existed purely to dominate the world. And Seto eventually used those lessons to partner with the Big Five and Mokuba to take over the company, at which point Goaburo seems to take his own life out of shame, though he really just places his mind in the virtual world like he had with Noah. Years later, during the virtual world arc, Goaburo reveals himself to be the true mastermind behind Noah's plan, claiming that he was going to take over the entire world using Kaiba Corp's hidden missile system and global networks. When his plan collapses, he challenges Seto to a final duel, specifically making use of Exodia Necros to try and prey on Kaiba's first big loss to Yugi. Ultimately, though, Seto manages to outmaneuver this and beats his father in the duel. Following his defeat, the virtual world begins to collapse as Goaburo tries to take down the rest of the duelists with him. But Noah betrays him and helps everyone else escape, while he and his father are erased when the system is destroyed.
With that, we can get into our next group of duelists who are again from a filler arc, this time being Waking the Dragons.
And the best place to start here is with darts. 10,000 years ago, Atlantis was a secluded and seemingly perfect civilization. That changed when meteors carrying stones of the Orichalcos crashed into it. These stones granted immense knowledge and power that allowed Atlantis to advance faster than any civilization before or since. But that power also brought corruption over time, as the Orichalcos began twisting people into monsters by revealing the darkness within them. The king of Atlantis, Ironheart, passed the throne down to his son Darts, who saw the worst of the stone's influence when his wife Iona was transformed into a monster. He began to believe that the Orichalcos exposed humanity's true nature and started to commune with the stone, and ultimately they gave him power, an army of Orichalcos soldiers, and a mission to resurrect the great Leviathan so that he could destroy the world and rebuild it free of evil. However, the more power that the Orichalcos gave him, the more corrupted he became. Ironheart, as well as Darts' daughter Chris, fled and rallied their own army of duel monsters, including the 3 legendary dragons, to try and stop him. This led to the Battle of Atlantis, where neither side really won. The dragons were sealed in ice, and the Leviathan was imprisoned. Darts' army was destroyed, and Atlantis sank below the ocean. But from there, Darts dedicated himself to reviving the Leviathan by collecting human souls, and thanks to the Orichalcos, he could continue to do so for thousands of years. Eventually, he crossed paths with Pharaoh Atem in ancient Egypt, and recognized that the pharaoh had a powerful soul, but he was unable to claim it at the time due to Bakura and Zork's interference, which forced Darts to wait thousands of more years. Eventually, he created the Doma Organization, using duel monsters to harvest souls through the Seal of Orichalcos, and with this, he went on to amass millions of souls in preparation for the Leviathan's return. His 3 main followers were Raphael, Valen, and Alistair, and they had their lives deliberately shaped by him to leave them angry, isolated, and loyal only to his cause. Once he recruited them, each of them was given a fragment of the Orichalcos, granting them power on par with the Millennium Items, as well as the ability to interfere with the Seal of Orichalcos if needed. Once Darts realized that the pharaoh had been reborn in the modern era, he tried to block Atem from reclaiming his memories by freezing the Tablet of Memories before sending his agents to steal the Egyptian god cards. However, Yugi, Kaiba, and Joey were all able to ally with the legendary dragons. Everything came to a head in a final duel between Atem, Kaiba, and Darts, and Atem ultimately won by restoring the legendary dragons to their original human form and freeing the captured souls of Yugi, Kaiba, and Joey. This wasn't the end though, as Darts sacrificed his own soul to fully revive the Great Leviathan, raising Atlantis from the sea and fusing himself with it. In response, Atem summoned the Egyptian gods, who destroyed the Leviathan and released the rest of the souls that he had trapped. What remained was the Leviathan's core darkness and Darts' spirit, which Atem was able to banish. This freed Darts from the Orichalcos' influence and allowed him to reunite with his family in the afterlife as Atlantis finally sank again. Darts has the honor of playing one of the most nerfed decks of all time, at least in terms of the version that we got in the real world. While the anime cards are all fairly powerful, the actual ones are pretty terrible. In particular, he upgraded the Seal of Orichalcos into Deuteros and Tritos, and supplemented his field with powerful monsters like Orichalcos Shuneros, and ultimately the Divine Serpent Ge, who had infinite attack, though this was overcome when Atem said, "Nuh-uh, I attack with infinity and won." Now the first member of Doma that we're going to be talking about is Garimo. Garimo served as Raphael's subordinate and is introduced early in the arc as he quickly defeats Rex and Weevil to capture both of their souls in the process. After Raphael, Valen, and Alistair steal the Egyptian gods, Obelisk is handed off to Garimo and he uses it to challenge Yugi, alongside activating the Seal of Orichalcos in an attempt to take Yugi's soul. By empowering Obelisk with the seal's influence, Garimo was able to control the god card without suffering the lethal backlash that normally affects any unworthy duelist, though it still took a pretty bad physical toll on him. Despite this, Yugi managed to overcome Obelisk and ultimately wins the duel, resulting in Garimo's soul being taken by the Orichalcos, though not before he throws Obelisk to Raphael. His Orichalcos stone is then claimed by Atem, and later used in his duel against Raphael, where Raphael defeats him and recovers it. Aside from Obelisk though, Grimo's deck largely revolves around warrior monsters like Marauding Captain and Warrior Digrapher, alongside spells like Warrior Returning Alive and the A-Forces. Now getting into the main subordinates in Doma, and we have Raphael. He was a rich kid with a nearly perfect life alongside his 2 younger siblings, Sonia and Julian. However, things changed when their family left for a cruise, and a massive tidal wave wrecked the ship and left Raphael as the sole survivor, all alone on a desert island for 3 years. The only thing that kept him going were his guardian cards, and over time he began even seeing them as living spirits. His rescue made international news, but it didn't lead him to any better life. His relatives stole his inheritance, and strangers everywhere tried to exploit him until he had nothing left. Raphael eventually became one of the strongest duelists in the world and even won a national championship in the United States, all while avoiding public attention as best he could. But that didn't stop Darts from finding him. He began manipulating Raphael, showed him physical proof of his family's death in the shipwreck, and broke him down until the only thing in his life that mattered was serving the Orichalcos, which was all the more terrible as Darts had been the one who created the storm that took Raphael's family. As one of Darts' top enforcers, Raphael captured countless souls and came to believe that Atem was an evil being that needed to be stopped. In their first duel, Raphael tricks Atem into activating the Seal of Orichalcos and leads to Atem's defeat, though Yugi ultimately sacrifices himself instead. When Raphael later learns the truth, he pursues Atem again, eventually forcing Atem to regain the trust of his legendary dragon. In Raphael's final duel with Atem, he breaks free of the Seal's control and conceded the duel by draining his own life points, and in the end, he was spared when the Seal failed to take his soul as he lacked any hatred. Soon afterwards, Raphael manages to save Mai and Valen from the collapsing building before confronting Darts, but Darts reveals that he is the one behind the tidal wave, and Raphael's anger causes him to fall victim to the Orichalcos once again, and this time it is able to take his soul until the Leviathan is defeated by Yugi. Raphael's deck makes use of Guardian Monsters, a group of cards which each has their own associated equip spell called Treasures. Most notably, he plays while trying to avoid letting any of his monsters die so that he can summon Guardian Iatos. And when this fails, he can resort to summoning Guardian Death Scythe, a strategy that marks Raphael as Yugi's only real loss in the series that wasn't intentional or the result of some level of cheating, though it is a filler duel. Doma's next member is Alistar. Alistar grew up in a country devastated by war. In the original version, the conflict was fueled by weapons supplied to both sides by Goaburo Kaiba, while the dub showed that Kaiba Corp was forcefully buying and clearing the land as it drove residents into hiding just to survive. Alistar and his brother were eventually torn apart, and his brother was killed by invading soldiers, leaving Alistar with nothing but anger and his brother's broken Dynadude action figure. He blamed Kaiba Corp, and more specifically Seto Kaiba, for what happened and devoted himself for taking revenge. Darts later found him and recruited him into the Doma Organization, though Alistar never knew that Darts had been the one impersonating Goaburo Kaiba and was actually responsible for the war that tore his homeland apart. Alistar only duels a few times in the series, and both of them are against Seto Kaiba. In the first duel, he disguises himself as Maximillion Pegasus and challenges Kaiba, revealing his identity midway through the duel once Kaiba realizes that something is off, though the match ultimately ends in a draw. The second duel involves Alistar hijacking a plane with Kaiba and Mokuba on board and challenging Kaiba mid-flight. When Kaiba begins to win, Alistar refuses to end his turn and plans to let the plane crash to kill all of them rather than letting himself lose. But Kaiba goads him on, saying that he could solve any impossible situation. For example, he would have stopped the soldiers if they had threatened to kill Mokuba, and he wanted to prove that he could solve the impossible if Alistar ended his turn. At which point he uses the Fang of Critias to win the duel and prevent the crash. As the Seal of Orichalcos claims his soul, Alistar sees Mokuba as a stand-in for his own brother and gives him the Dynadude figure before collapsing. Though after Darts and the Great Leviathan are defeated, Alistar is freed alongside the other captured souls. Alistar's first deck is largely based on Pegasus's, though once he reveals himself, he also has a focus on a monster called Gorlog, who gains attack based on the number of fire monsters on the field. Not only that, but if it destroys an opponent's monster in battle, it can summon that monster to Alistar's field as a fire monster. Meanwhile, his actual deck has more of an army theme to it, largely made of machine monsters and focused on summoning robot tokens through the air fortress Ziggurat. And lastly, we have Valen, who grew up as an orphan that loved to fight, though he was looked after by a kind nun who tried to steer him away from violence. When local criminals forced the church closed, Valen nearly fought back, but the nun stopped him, and that same night, the church was set on fire, likely with the nun still inside. Believing the criminals were responsible, Valen later confronted them in an alley, and he was arrested and sent to prison as a result, where eventually he was offered a chance at freedom by defeating other prisoners in duels, using the Seal of Orichalcos thanks to Darts. After winning, Valen accepted Darts' offer to work for him, and as you might imagine at this point, he was unaware that Darts was the one who burned his church down. Over time, Valen developed feelings for Mai Valentine, and repeatedly tried to impress her, though this often led him to interfering in her duels and clashing with people close to her like Joey Wheeler. Valen ultimately lost his duel to Joey, and the Orichalcos takes his soul as a result, and his body is later recovered by Raphael, and after Darts' defeat, his soul is restored. As for his deck, it is fairly strange as it involves an archetype of cards that act as battle armor in his duel, which seems odd, but then Joey also has armor cards, so it kinda worked out. And finally, we have the Orichalcos Soldier, who was created by the Leviathan to help Darts conquer Atlantis. They are only seen using the Seal of Orichalcos and Orichalcos Gigas. That is kind of their whole thing, which means we can jump over to the final filler arc, the KC Grand Championship. Starting things off, we have the main antagonist of the arc, Siegfried von Schroeder. Siegfried comes from an aristocratic German family alongside his younger brother Leon. From a young age, Siegfried was groomed to become the future head of the Schroeder Corporation, leaving him with very little time to actually be a brother. Leon's attempts to spend time with him were completely discouraged, and over time Siegfried was taught that success was the only thing that mattered. He met Seto Kaiba at a business party when they were both still children, and wanting to prove himself as a prodigy, Siegfried hacked Kaiba Corp's systems on the spot. However, he soon became obsessed with the idea of surpassing Seto Kaiba and showing his own superiority. After repeated losses drove his father to instability, Siegfried took over as CEO of Schroeder Corp. He abandoned the company's military interest and shifted focus into gaming, pushing himself even harder when he learned that Kaiba had done the same. He eventually developed advanced holographic Duel Monsters technology, only to once again be beaten to the punch by Seto Kaiba, who had secured a deal with Industrial Illusions. This only made his anger with Kaiba even stronger, as he believed that he was stealing his ideas. Under the new alias Siegfried Lloyd, he quietly became Europe's top duelist, while keeping his true identity and connection with Leon hidden. When Kaiba Corp announced the Grand Championship at Kaibaland, Siegfried hacked the park's systems, caused chaos during the early rounds, and deliberately drew Kaiba's attention by acting suspicious. Throughout the tournament, he defeated Rex and Weevil in a single turn, beat Joey using his Valkyrie and Goddess strategies, and advanced to the semi-finals. Kaiba eventually uncovered his true identity and disqualified him, but Siegfried challenged him directly, clearly stating his plans to ruin Kaiba Corp and replace Kaiba as Pegasus's business partner. However, Kaiba defeats him here, just as he had in the past. Before the finals, Siegfried secretly gave his brother Leon the Golden Castle of Strongberg, revealing that his true plan had been to act as a distraction while Leon was guided to the championship match. Siegfried had even rewritten Kaiba Corp's systems to turn Strongberg into both a duel-breaking card and a massive computer virus. Although the card eventually destroyed itself and Yugi defeated Leon fairly, Siegfried initially believed that he had won by damaging Kaiba Corp's data. But then Kaiba tells him that he had backed everything up from the start, meaning that Siegfried's final move was completely meaningless. Ultimately, he accepts his defeat, and Leon convinces him that his worth isn't tied to beating Kaiba. With that, they move forward without revenge in mind. As I mentioned, Siegfried uses the Valkyrie archetype, which stalls out the game and then manipulates the top card of his opponent's deck through the Goddess cards, which benefit from guessing the card that they had just looked at, often allowing him to deal with his opponent's cards before they even get played. Now back to Siegfried's brother, Leon, though. Leon grew up largely ignored by his family, who was entirely focused on preparing Siegfried to inherit the corporation. Any attempt that Leon made to spend time with his brother was treated as a distraction and often punished. He was left on his own, and so he developed a love for fairy tales and eventually for Duel Monsters. He even wrote directly to Maximillion Pegasus, asking for fairy tale themed cards, which Pegasus agreed to create and send to him. As Leon grew older, he wanted to prove himself and secretly entered tournaments under a false name until Siegfried discovered the truth, after which he invited Leon to help run the Siegfried Corporation, promising that he would no longer be alone anymore. Leon first meets Yugi when Siegfried hacks Kaibaland's system, and impressed by Yugi's skills, he reveals that he is also competing in the KC Grand Championship. Throughout the tournament, he manages to defeat Dr. Goat, Ethan Shark, and later Rebecca Hawkins using his fairy tale deck, with cards including things like Cinderella, Forest Hunter, and Forest Wolf, 7 Goat Kids, and Little Red Riding Hood. After Siegfried is disqualified, he gives Leon the Golden Castle of Strongberg, and unaware that the card also functions as a massive virus, Leon uses it in the finals against Yugi. Partway through the duel, Leon realizes what his brother is trying to do and refuses to continue helping him, though he is unable to remove the castle from play. And ultimately, Yugi destroys the castle by turning its effect against itself while Kaiba stops the virus. When Leon tries to surrender, Yugi encourages him to continue fighting, only for Yugi to beat him soon after anyways. Now, outside the Von Schroeders, there are about a dozen other duelists who took part in the Kaiba Corp Grand Championships that haven't been covered so far. However, none of them are really all that deep, so I'll just be giving a quick description of who they are and their decks, of which only one really matters in any way, and that is Vivian Wong. She is an actress, model, kung fu champion, and the Duel Queen of Asia, who gained that title after beating the Supreme Clan of 9 Dragons. And fitting to this, her deck largely features Asian and dragon-inspired cards, things like Dragon Lady, Thunder Nian Yan, and Soul Tiger, for example. Then we have some duelists who we only really see but don't really know much about. Paul McGregor is a duelist inspired by Sherlock Holmes. Fortune Salim is a fortune teller who gets impersonated by Rex and Weevil. Ball-Free Ginger is a magician with a bowl cut, while Totani Aiolis is a magician who does illusions and makes pigeons appear. Jafar Shin is an Indian-inspired duelist. Shane Jordan is an American cowboy with a guitar. Richard Goat is a doctor who always travels with 2 nurses. Abe the Monkey Man is a man with a pet monkey, though notably the monkey is the smart one in the pair. Sergei Ivanov is a Russian bodybuilder, and Ethan Shark is like a Mad Max-style Australian. With that though, we have covered every duelist in the main series, however we do have a few other characters worth mentioning. And firstly, I feel like I gotta include Shadi. He is a fairly consistent recurring character who never really duels in the main series, though they do appear in several games with a pretty consistent deck. In terms of story, Shadi is a bit of a weird one, as he is either a spirit who guarded the tombs of ancient Egypt for thousands of years, or he had just been killed by Yami Bakura a few years ago. And this depends on whether we're looking at the main series or the Dark Side of Dimensions. Either way, he had been charged with protecting the Millennium Items, in some cases directly, while in other cases he would simply appear to the items' hosts. As part of that duty, Shadi forcibly entrusted the Millennium Eye to Maximillion Pegasus after demonstrating its power by punishing a grave robber. He also played a key role in setting major events in the story in motion, for example, warning Marik Ishtar that the Pharaoh would one day return. Shadi appears to Yugi during Duelist Kingdom, entering his mind and discovering that Yugi's soul had been split between himself and the Pharaoh. While searching for clues about the theft of the Millennium Eye by Bakura, Shadi was nearly destroyed by the dangers inside the Pharaoh's mind. However, he was saved by Yugi and was left deeply impressed by Yugi when he convinced the Dark Magician to stand down through compassion rather than through force, leading Shadi to suspect that Yugi was the true chosen one. Throughout Battle City, Shadi continued acting as a guide rather than a participant. He warned Yugi about the dangers of having all 7 Millennium Items being gathered in one place. He explained the cursed origins of the Egyptian god cards, and he met with Ishizu Ishtar to discuss the growing threat of Marik. He also intervened directly to save Tristan and Duke when they were about to fall off the blimp. But this isn't the only era where Shadi had been active though. For example, he had tested Alexander the Great for worthiness of the Millennium Ring, and later oversees a symbolic duel between Atem and Yami Alexander for its power. Finally, during the Dark RPG, Shadi assists Atem by guiding his friends into the Millennium World and possessing another body to aid Pharaoh Atem in his final battle against Zork Necrophades, where Shadi is ultimately destroyed. After the ceremonial duel, with attempts passing on and the Millennium Items finally being taken care of, Shadi appears one last time in the collapsing tomb as his spirit fades. In most appearances within the games, Shadi tends to play an ancient-based deck, Millennium Golem, Sengenjin, Orion the Battle King, and Cosmo Queen being some of his more regular cards. But aside from Shadi, we also have 3 Yu-Gi-Oh! Films, first of which is Pyramid of Light, which introduces us to Anubis. Anubis is an ancient sorcerer who commanded Shadow Realm monsters and worked alongside Akhenaten to create the Pyramid of Light. This was an imperfect and unstable imitation of the Millennium Puzzle. Akhenaten intended to use the pyramid to help his son usurp Atem, but Anubis betrayed him and stole it instead, planning to use its power to wipe out all life on Earth. Atem confronted and defeated Anubis back then with the Dagger of Fate, but Anubis had sealed his own soul inside the pyramid before it was fully destroyed. Thousands of years later, archaeologists uncover his tomb, and when Yugi solves the Millennium Puzzle, both Atem and Anubis are awakened, causing the tomb to collapse. Eventually, Anubis' remains and relics, including the Pyramid of Light, were moved to the Domino City Museum, and Anubis was able to act on his own again. From here, he anticipated Seto Kaiba's plans and secretly planted the Pyramid of Light card alongside Maximillion Pegasus' collection. Kaiba later claims the card alongside the Blue Eyes Shining Dragon, unknowingly giving Anubis the opportunity to manipulate things. When Kaiba activates the pyramid during the duel against Yugi and Atem, it triggers a shadow game, and removes the Egyptian gods from play, which allows Anubis to invade the Millennium Puzzle. As the duel escalates, he takes direct control, summoning the Sphinx monsters and nearly winning. However, Yugi manages to weaken the pyramid from within with the Dagger of Fate, and Atem was able to push back against Anubis, eventually winning by using the Blue Eyes Shining Dragon. As for his deck, Anubis' main strategy revolves around the Pyramid of Light, Androsphinx, Sphinx Telia, and Phanon the Great Sphinx. The second movie, Bonds Beyond Time, brought another villain with Paradox, though this time Yugi gets to partner with Yusei Fudo and Jaden Yuki to take them on. Paradox was one of the few survivors of the Mech Lord Emperor genocide alongside Zone, Antimony, and later Aporia. The four worked together to prevent the apocalypse that destroyed their world, successfully granting Zone immortality through a life support system. Over time, however, Paradox, Antimony, and Aporia all died of natural causes, leaving Zone as the sole survivor. To continue his plan, Zone created a robotic recreation of Paradox as a child, and programmed him with the same hatred of duel monsters as the original Paradox. He was sent back in time to kill Maximillion Pegasus, preventing duel monsters from ever becoming widespread and erasing the future that led to the genocide. Rather than assassinate Pegasus quietly, Paradox chose to kill him publicly to turn the world against the game entirely, believing that the collateral damage was necessary to save humanity. Paradox first appears during Yusei Fudo's era, interrupting a turbo duel and absorbing Stardust Dragon into a corrupted card before vanishing. He then travels further back in time into Jaden's era, attacking Venice and using powerful monsters like Stardust Dragon against Jaden. Yusei followed him through time with the help from Crimson Dragon, saving Jaden and continuing to follow Paradox until they arrive in Yugi's time, where Paradox attacks an event hosted by Pegasus, killing Pegasus and Solomon Moto in an alternate timeline and claiming that the world had been saved. Yugi, the sole survivor of the event, joins Yusei and Jaden, and the three travel back in time 30 minutes before the attack to evacuate civilians and confront Paradox directly. The confrontation led to a 3-on-1 duel with Paradox using Malefic World and corrupted versions of iconic monsters, and despite briefly overpowering them with Malefic Truth Dragon, Paradox is ultimately defeated through the combined efforts of the protagonists. And finally, we have the dark side of dimensions with our last duelist, Aigami, or Diva. Aigami, his sister Sarah, Manny, and several other orphans were all kept by a cruel slave merchant at one point in the past. Although they were allowed to sleep in his home, they were forced to beg on the streets for money, which the merchant would keep for himself. If they failed to bring back enough, they were punished and denied food, though Manny points out that the merchant would never be satisfied no matter how much they collected. This would come to an end when Shadi appeared. He immobilized the merchant with his magic, marked the children with glowing symbols, and warped them away. However, he also erased the merchant from existence using the Quantum Cube. These children were taken to Egypt, where Shadi became a mentor to them. He taught Aigami, Sarah, and Manny about the Plana, as well as the Millennium Items, explaining that some of them represented justice, others were vulnerable to evil, and that the Millennium Puzzle embodied both. Shadi believed that Aigami possessed power comparable to the one destined to solve the puzzle, and told them that if all 7 of the Millennium Items were gathered, a gateway to a better world would open for the children. But eventually, Bakura's father arrives at the shrine and attempts to obtain the Millennium Ring. This encounter led to Ryo Bakura coming into contact with the ring and awakening Yami Bakura, who attacks and kills Shadi. With his last words, Shadi entrusts the Quantum Cube to Aigami, and afterwards, he, Sarah, and Manny live with other children on a secluded plateau above the clouds. Eventually, Aigami chose to leave the group of children, and Manny follows to watch over him. Soon, Aigami became concerned that Kaiba's excavation of the ceremonial chamber might uncover the Millennium Puzzle, and so he sends Manny to secretly monitor the dig, with the plan being to erase anyone who manages to find the puzzle. As a backup, Aigami decided that the safest way to prevent the Pharaoh's return was to eliminate his vessel. So, to get close to Yugi, he alters the memory of Domino City and makes it seem as though he has always been a student at Domino High. As a result, Yugi and his friends recognize him but can't quite remember his name. Soon he confronts Kaiba at the Mortuary Temple, where he explains that the Quantum Cube works through collective consciousness and allows the Plana to override reality itself. However, when he tries to use the cube on Kaiba, it fails, seemingly purely based on Kaiba's dual disc technology and his overwhelming ego, and so the two decide to have a dimension duel instead. Aigami manages to easily pull ahead with his cubic monsters, however Kaiba pulls Obelisk the Tormentor directly out of the ground and takes control. Before the duel can end, Kaiba withdraws, prioritizing Mokuba's escape with the puzzle. However, before he can get away, Aigami manages to steal 2 Millennium Puzzle pieces. From here, he goes on to pretend to be friends with Yugi and the gang to get them to lower their guards until he uses his quantum cube to force Joey and Bakura into different dimensions. In Joey's case, he was put into a world that was only built from his own memories, and every time he forgot even a small detail, that detail would be erased forever, though eventually Item's spirit arrives and saves him. Meanwhile, Aigami confronts Bakura directly, forcing him to relive the moment where Yami Bakura kills Shadi. This makes Bakura break down and he begins apologizing, insisting that the ring controlled him. Manny then appears and is corrupted by the actual Millennium Ring and begins attacking Bakura as well, though ultimately he sacrifices himself when he comes to his senses and protects Aigami and Bakura from the ring. Aigami later reveals that he is a Plana named Diva, and the version of Aigami that Yugi had known is a fake. Shortly afterwards, Kaiba Corp agents abduct Diva and bring him to Seto Kaiba, who demands the Millennium puzzle pieces. When Diva refuses, he is imprisoned at Kaiba Land, and ultimately it is decided that Kaiba would duel both Yugi and Diva for the remaining Millennium puzzle pieces. Yugi duels Diva first and ultimately defeats him, allowing Bakura to return to the real world as Diva's soul vanishes into the other dimension. However, this is the dimension where Manny had died, and Aigami encounters the Millennium Ring. Its evil takes control over him, transforms him into a monster, and fuses him with the Millennium Item, and he returns to the real world to challenge Yugi and Kaiba. In the end, though, the revival of Pharaoh ends this conflict, purges the world of the ring's darkness, and returns Diva to normal before removing all of the kid's Plana abilities. And with that, we have reached our last deck. Diva used the Cubic deck, which involves summoning and leveling up cubic monsters until he reaches Crimson Nova Trinity, the Dark Cubic Lord. A card which can't be targeted or destroyed by effects, which can burn your opponents for half their life whenever it attacks, can attack twice per turn, and if that's not enough, can also redirect effect damage and has 4,500 attack itself. This all combined to make a particularly brutal monster to deal with, but even the smaller cubics are extremely tricky to take out and can negate effects as well, while others can consistently burn all duelists for a large chunk of their life points at the end of the turn. But with that, we have covered every duelist in the series, so let me know which your favorites are, which decks you like the most, and who has the best story. I'm always a huge sucker for Marik, but I would love to hear your thoughts as well. If you enjoyed, remember to leave a like and subscribe for more, and if you are interested, you can check out some of our Pokemon videos, or this one on every Sonic the Hedgehog character. With that said though, thank you all so much for watching, and we will see you in the next one.